Everything around them was ablaze and crackling. It seemed as if the fire was blanketing the entire space around them, and there was absolutely no escape. There was nowhere to expect salvation. The two of them took refuge in the midst of the raging flames around them, holding hands to encourage each other. Escape was impossible, and they prepared for their inevitable death. But one of them was certain it was bound to happen. She believed it and tried to convince her companion otherwise, that they were bound to be rescued and would survive. This young creature was incredibly similar to her in appearance. It seemed as if they were sisters, and no one could tell them apart. These words were spoken by Saint Cordelia. These two girls were different from the overly fanatical saints. They did not want to suffer a similar fate, and so they desperately hoped that someone else would be able to save them. At that moment, they were inside a fire raging around them, and they absolutely did not want to suffer a tragic fate. They did not want to burn alive in this terrible flame. The flames seemed to grow stronger, and the heat burned their bodies ever hotter. They were at the very center of the fire and could not escape in any way. In a last attempt to encourage each other, the girls grabbed each other by the hand, and one of them was sure that now an inevitable fate awaited them, and no one could save them. This girl was not a saint and knew that she would definitely die now, so she thought that no one could save them and prepared herself for the worst. In despair at everything that was happening to her, she closed her eyes and prepared to meet her inevitable death, which seemed to be getting closer and closer to her. Suddenly, both girls' attention was distracted by some movement happening very close to them inside the center of the fire, and they both turned their heads in amazement in the direction of this movement. It turned out someone was approaching them. They couldn't see his face yet, but they were sure they had just heard someone's footsteps, and they seemed to be getting louder. Saint Cordelia turned her head towards the approaching men and addressed her companion with the words that she should look at the people who came to save them from death. It was possible that it was just an illusion, or an optical illusion, because no one was visible yet except this girl, who was holding out her hand in hope, waiting to be saved. The flames flared up again, even more fiercely. Smoke billowed and engulfed everything around it. The temperature inside the hearth grew ever higher and more unbearable, threatening the lives of both girls. Indeed, soon some men appeared within the flames. They looked rather strange, differing in appearance and clothing. One of them picked up the saint in his arms to carry her out of the blazing fire, and at that moment, the saint's companion finally understood that these people had come here not to save them, but only with the goal of saving one of them, who was considered a saint, from death. Her companion remained seated, sadly and tearfully watching the departing crowd. She decided to wave her hand at Saint Cordelia and bid farewell to her and to her life. She understood that the men had come into this flame only to save the saint, and they were completely indifferent to the fate of their companion, who now remained inside the hearth. The girl jumped up from her seat in a last attempt to save her life. She hoped that she would still be able to avoid a tragic fate and escape this fiery ring. There were tears on her cheeks. The heat of the fire burned her face, but she quickly tried to catch up with the men who had appeared and try to escape by following them. But her attempt was futile. The fire flared even more fiercely, and the girl screamed loudly from the heat and flames surrounding her, terrified, foreseeing her end. The little girl's companion was Saint Cordelia. She was beloved by all. No one could escape her charm, and so everyone was very well disposed toward her, and the one left behind by the people who had entered the scorching flames turned out to be a simple girl. Her name was also Cordelia, and she was a commoner named after a saint so revered by other commoners. And at that moment, a true tragedy occurred that could have been avoided. It haunted this little girl her entire life, because not only did she share the same name, but she was also blessed with the saint's face and was indistinguishable from her in appearance. Now she found herself bound hand and foot. To prevent her from resisting, they also gagged her. The girl eavesdropped on her guards' conversation and heard them discussing her specifically. She overheard these people discussing her name, and one of them said that her name was indeed exactly the same as that of a saint named Cordelia. Another added that from behind, the girl looked exactly like the saint, and so he didn't immediately understand what was going on. The girl was in despair. Her whole life had turned into a real tragedy, and now she realized it had been just a simple mistake, and it seemed there was no way she could have avoided it. This day was different in many ways from others similar to it, but the only difference that set it apart was that today, Saint Cordelia was to perform a sacred ceremony. and a day was about to arrive that would change the future. It was this day that was supposed to stop the destruction of the world that surrounded the little girl. Duke Alessandro von Valencia, a representative of one of the four main families of the empire, was very interested in this. It was this young man, a true villain who did everything in the name of power, who decided to acquire unprecedented power. And to this end, he decided to kidnap Saint Cordelia. At this point, the Duke clutched his head as if suffering from a headache and said that the place where the ceremony was originally held was a shrine, and it seemed they did not need to change anything to achieve the goal. After his companion told the Duke that only Arixa could have fooled them like that, the young man looked at the feet of his prisoner and began to think about what they should do now with this girl, whom they had captured in their hands. Cordelia was perfectly aware of everything happening around her. She carefully observed the people moving around her, trying to figure out what awaited her in the near future. She realized that the main one among these people was one of the four true pillars of the empire, Duke von Valencia. He had stolen her for a specific purpose, and now didn't know what to do to finally gain this enormous power for himself. He simply had no choice but to cover up the traces of his crime. It was precisely for this purpose that he was now planning to get rid of his prisoner. His eyes suddenly turned scarlet, and he decided that perhaps he should kill this girl. She assumed a similar fate would eventually await her. It was also clear that no one and nothing could save her from death, and so she prepared herself to accept her fate with humility. It seems fate had been preparing the girl for this end to her life since early childhood. Throughout her life, Cordelia was considered a saint, and even now she is destined to die due to yet another misunderstanding. Unfortunately, everything worked against her. She couldn't change the events that led to her ending up here. It all happened because of the Duke of Valencia, who decided to use the saint as a key to power and committed numerous terrible acts. The girl was just a random victim, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so, certain death awaited her. And it was all a story from a book about the future. She finished reading this book and realized that perhaps this was exactly the fate that awaited her. In this book, the death of a girl named Cordelia was destined. The pages of this book would not leave her head, and so the girl screamed in horror that it was she who grabbed her head, and was horrified by the end that, apparently, was prepared for her. Cordelia understood that she could not change anything in this course of fate, and in the end, she jumped up in horror and said that she had enough, and she did not even want to think about anything like that anymore. Sitting in the house where she now found herself, the girl could not help but think that she had never intended to write this book, and she could not understand when, in that case, she had managed to read it. Cordelia decided she absolutely had to try to change the course of events as described. With that in mind, she packed her things into a bag and now tried to hide it under her enormous brown cloak. Her entire body was covered by this cloak, and the girl hoped that if she covered the bag with her things with her huge robe, then perhaps no one would notice her. She spread her arms wide and began to spin around, trying to check if her things were securely hidden. Finally, she thought everything was perfect, and the bag was perfectly hidden from view. Inside the bag were things she'd found at the dump, some shabby clothes, and a small piece of bread. The girl again remembered what was written in this book about her, and thought that, if we were to believe its plot, then the period of her misfortunes began soon after she met a saint who wanted to help her. Therefore, her main motive for fleeing was the desire to avoid meeting Saint Cordelia. She decided to flee as quickly as possible to change her fate and achieve a different life. She knew she might not be able to do this, but if there was even a small chance of salvation, she should definitely take advantage of it, so as to never cross paths with either the saint or the Duke's family. The girl was determined to commit this desperate act and escape from the house where she had recently found shelter. She understood that she had to get as far away from there as she could. At the moment when she was about to leave the house, the girl heard behind her the angry screams of a fat woman who was loudly calling her name, urging her to stop. Cordelia was literally dumbfounded by her inability to escape unnoticed. The woman asked her why the girl had frozen and ordered her to hurry and complete her task as quickly as possible. The girl continued on her way, thinking that she'd never heard of the saint before. That was until she was nicknamed Fake Cordelia due to her resemblance to the saint, and so she needed to escape before she was noticed. But the angry woman literally appeared in front of her and immediately began shouting loudly at the little runaway. She told her not to even think about shirking her work, as she knew the illness had already subsided. The girl raised her head to the woman who was still screaming and who also called her a lazy pig. She thought she'd had enough of the woman standing before her, and it was time to stop her bullying. So she decided to shout loudly in her face what she hadn't intended to say. She remembered that about a year had passed since she had managed to escape from the orphanage. She was absolutely certain that she would succeed this time too. Cordelia interrupted the screaming fat woman and told her that she only stopped because she saw a huge pile of fat in front of her and could not get past it. Her interlocutor pressed her lips together nervously, seemingly about to unleash another torrent of abuse. It seemed she was taking as much air as she could into her lungs, ready to rant again, but the little girl wasn't at all frightened. She asked the woman why she was staring at her like that, and wondered if her brains were clogged with fat too, since it looked exactly like that. After this, Cordelia fell silent and began to look ahead with determination. Her face was filled with determination and a readiness to fight back against the woman who had bullied her for so long. The face she was now looking at was simply terrifying. It seemed to her that it wasn't the face of a human, but rather that of some monster about to belch a stream of flame at her. Well, in the end, to escape, she had to make peace with the woman first. So she promised to carry out her orders when she said they needed to move faster, thrusting a bag of flowers into her hands and saying that if the girl didn't sell everything, she'd go without food that day. She grabbed the basket and ran off, holding it in her hand. As she said goodbye, she even managed to ask if she'd ever done a bad job. The woman ordered her to cover her mouth, promising to give her a good spanking, and said that she spoke as if she had never been hungry before. Cordelia decided to ignore this last phrase. She silently continued on her way, hoping that she would be able to leave this place and its hated mistress as soon as possible. But after taking a few steps, the girl suddenly stopped and slowly turned around on the spot, looking towards her mistress. After this, she did not slow down, but only slightly accelerated and began to move in the direction of the fat woman. When she was very close to the girl, she gave her a strong kick in the butt with all her might. The evil mistress felt the blow and turned back in anger, glaring with hatred at the little girl, who was quickly moving away from her. Soon, her movements turned into a run, but the little rascal was no longer catchable or elusive. She quickly began to approach the front door, turned around for a second, made a nasty face like her mistress, and was gone. As she was saying goodbye, she still didn't forget to imitate the sounds that were very similar to those that a sheep usually makes. And then the girl left the house and went out onto the street to carry out the orders of the evil fat woman. She walked down the street with her purse in hand, reflecting on how fickle fate could be. She wanted to leave this house and the city as quickly as possible to avoid a tragic outcome in the future, but she absolutely did not want to meet the saint. Besides, she still didn't know how to fulfill her assignment. She picked up one of the flowers and looked at it, wondering how anyone could sell such crudely picked flowers. Then she mentally addressed the flower and told it not to worry, for it had died for a good cause. The girl waved her hand and threw the flower from her hand onto the stone road. She had no intention of doing anything like that again, and today was the last day she would be in this city. The flower she'd thrown seemed to hang in the air, slowly descending toward the road. The girl was saying goodbye to it, and at the same time, to both orders and the saint. When the flower was already lying on the stone slab, she mentally said goodbye to the Duke's family and said goodbye to her mother. The little child looked up to the sky and told her mother that she would be okay. That was precisely why she had decided to do this, determined to escape her hated mistress and the future that, according to the book's plot, awaited her. She remembered how she felt when she read about her death in a book and thought that she did not want to be alone in the fire, because then she would inevitably die in the flames. Imagining herself bound and gagged, the girl decided she had absolutely no desire to die for other people. She just wanted to live, and she was willing to do anything to achieve that. When she decided to run away, there was a bit of a commotion, and so, during this commotion after her escape, she met Madame Pamel, in whose house she had lived after escaping from the orphanage. Cordelia walked down the street, thinking that nothing was lost yet, and that everything could definitely be changed. A way to survive, no matter what, could always be found. Her thoughts kept returning to the book's plot. She remembered that if she didn't do anything, a cruel end awaited her, and no one would be able to come to her aid. Therefore, she needed to act immediately and try to change her future. She recalled the words she'd heard many times before when people looked at her. They'd said her face was just like a monster's, and asked if that was true. Then they'd add that this girl shared the same name as the saint. They didn't fail to notice, however, that the face and soul of this commoner and Saint Cordelia were different. This was very difficult for the girl, and she subsequently became embarrassed by her name, wanting to rid herself of it forever. She recalled the moment when she had been in the middle of a blazing fire. Those young gentlemen who had so ardently courted the saint hated her. Perhaps they had even deliberately abandoned her in the fire. Remembering all this, the girl only quickened her pace. She broke into a run, thinking that she needed to get out of here as quickly as possible before the time came for this very future that didn't promise her anything good. But the next moment she stopped abruptly. A fleeting movement and an incomprehensible sound coming from the side forced her to stop running and look toward a nearby house. But there was something else that made the girl slow down abruptly. The smell of blood reached her. It was quite strong, and it seemed the victim was somewhere very close. She stopped, though. She wanted to make sure nothing terrible had happened to her. To that end, she peered around the corner and into the gateway of one of the houses. She saw a young man there who appeared to have fallen asleep briefly, but in fact, this was completely untrue, as he smelled strongly of blood. His entire clothing was bloodied, and he appeared to be seriously wounded. The little commoner approached the man and wondered if he was dead. She peered into his face, trying to see or hear if he was still breathing. It didn't escape her notice that, judging by everything, this man had been wealthy in life. Even with blood on his clothes, he looked luxurious. His entire attire spoke of the luxury and wealth he had likely enjoyed in life. The girl looked at him closely, and her eyes suddenly lit up with a predatory fire. Looking at the injured man's clothes, she suddenly wondered if this meant he was rich. She thought it all happened just in time for her because she needed the money. That's why the girl moved as close as possible to the young man to search his pockets, hoping to find something valuable. She kept her eyes fixed on the man's face as her hands searched his pockets for anything valuable. He seemed undead, but his breathing was ragged and his eyes remained closed. But the next moment, either from the movement that the girl next to him made or from the noise she made, one of the man's eyes opened slightly, and he looked straight into the face of the little girl sitting next to him. After this, the young man's second eye opened, and he saw in front of him a little girl who sat down next to him. Only a few moments had passed since he'd barely opened his eyes, but his reaction was swift. He grabbed the girl's wrist tightly with his hand and began to hold her. She realized she had likely made a mistake. At first, she tried to break free from his grip, but quickly realized it was futile. So she looked up into the man's face. At the same time, he was also studying the girl who had appeared here out of nowhere. The young man and the little commoner, who had found themselves in the courtyard of an abandoned house, studied each other attentively, without uttering a word. She really wished he'd pass out again. Then she could follow through with her plan to leave this man and go somewhere as far away from this city as possible. Since that was impossible to do now, she looked closely at the young man and began to study his appearance. It didn't escape her attention that he had silver hair and scarlet eyes. This seemed simply unbelievable to the girl. She came to the horrifying conclusion that this was the very man she had absolutely no desire to meet. This was the one she had so desperately wanted to escape from. The girl looked closely at the man's face, wanting to make sure she wasn't mistaken. Indeed, this was the man who had led the people who had kidnapped her. This was the very man who had so decisively influenced her fate. And now he sat before her, wounded, looking at her intently. She was glad he didn't know who she was. She remembered the last time she'd seen this man. Of course, that was in the future, but she hadn't forgotten anything. She hadn't forgotten that it was he who had ordered her capture, and then said she should be killed. She looked into his face and wondered if this could really be the Duke of Valencia who would haunt her in the future and order her life taken. She was unbearably afraid, but she couldn't escape because she was gripped by a strong male hand. Now she was certain that this was indeed the Duke, the man she had been trying to escape. Now the girl understood that she needed to get rid of him as quickly as possible and get as far away from here as quickly as possible. The man continued to hold the girl by the wrist. She didn't even try to resist, knowing it would be futile. She was far more preoccupied with the thought of how the Duke had ended up in this place, and what he was doing there. The young man seemed delirious. His eyes were expressionless and empty. Looking at the girl's face, he called her by the name Rosalind, probably mistaking her for someone he knew. His interlocutor couldn't understand who the man was talking about. She tried unsuccessfully to remember who he could be talking about. She told the man she had absolutely no idea who he was talking about. But suddenly, a completely incredible thought occurred to the girl. Perhaps she had read about this before in a book. After all, according to the plot, there was a moment when the Duke was attacked in a back alley. She was incredibly curious as to why all this had happened to the Duke today, precisely at the moment she had decided to escape. She tried to break free from his grasp, thinking that even when a man was on the brink of death, he still had plenty of strength left. She tried to pull her hand away again, but it proved quite difficult. The man's hand continued to grip the little girl's wrist tightly, preventing her from freeing herself. The next moment, something incredible happened. The girl literally lost her strength and speech. She couldn't believe this was really happening to her, and she only wondered what to do next. The basket of flowers she had brought overturned, and the plants intended for sale spilled out onto the stone pavement of the road. Cordelia couldn't resist what had happened. She didn't understand why the man had done this, and so she decided not to resist when he grabbed her by the body and pulled her toward him for a tight hug. He held the girl with one hand and began stroking her head with the other, asking how this could have happened. The girl thought he was delirious and completely out of his mind. She listened to his words, which seemed utterly meaningless in the current situation. He asked her why she hadn't chosen him, then added that he was ready to fall on his knees before her if she just said so. The delirious Duke told her she only needed to say one word for him to do anything. He promised to fulfill her every wish. The girl felt as if she were trapped in a vice-like grip in the young man's arms. She remained close to him, pressing her entire body against him, hoping that he would eventually weaken and she could take advantage of that and escape. She looked at the young man's face in surprise when he asked her to tell him she loved him. At that moment, she became completely convinced he mistook her for someone else. The injury seemed to have taken its toll on the man. He continued to restrain the girl, but his hands seemed to weaken and his voice gradually faded. When the man fell silent, she suddenly wondered if her hopes had really come true and the Duke had finally lost consciousness. She would very much like to be sure of this, but she did not dare to do so yet, and listened carefully to his breathing, and slightly began to move the arms that were clasped around her. As soon as she realized the young man had lost consciousness again, she began to free herself from his embrace. She slipped out from under his arm, hoping that he would remain unconscious. But she wasn't about to give up her prize, which was why she approached the young man. Although it wasn't easy to get, she eventually found herself holding a rather hefty purse, apparently filled with gold coins. Cordelia was satisfied with her haul. She deftly tossed the purse into the air, then weighed it in her palm and thought that it must contain a sizable sum which would be quite useful. She decided it was time for her to leave, so she turned around, carrying the purse in her hand and thinking that she had nothing else to do. When she looked back at the unconscious man, she felt a moment of pity for him. She wasn't sure he could survive and didn't need her help right now. She also wondered if he would feel indebted to her if she helped him. The girl looked at the man's face and thought that, judging by the plot of the novel, the Duke of Valencia is a very evil person, but he is certainly not ungrateful and will most likely be able to reward her for saving him. She thought she should at least take a small risk and try to do something for this man, and then everything would be as fate would decide. Perhaps this was her chance, and she should take it. She reached out to the seated man's face and thought that even if the Duke truly wanted her dead, seeing his face at moments like these was a blessing. And perhaps avoiding him now wasn't necessary to changing the future. The girl finally decided to perform an act of mercy. She decided she should try to help this man, and so she began dragging the man's body to a secluded place where she could help him. There was an abandoned house very close to this spot. Luckily, it wasn't far to pull the man, and eventually she pulled his unconscious body inside, and it became hard to breathe after the hard work. The girl wiped the sweat from her face and forehead and groaned loudly that she was so tired. She then added that, after all, any roof over one's head was better than the dirty streets. Right next to her lay the body of the young man she'd dragged here. He was still unconscious, and she needed help. The girl looked at his face and wondered how he hadn't woken up while she was dragging him. She was glad no one had noticed, but now she absolutely had to tend to his wound. She looked at him and thought that perhaps they had tried to stab him because there was so much blood around. There had been moments in her life when she was ready to eat a person out of hunger, but she had never suffered wounds like these. She looked at the man's face, then looked back at his wound and wondered how she could help him. Suddenly, a saving thought occurred to her. First of all, she needed to bandage the wound or at least stop the bleeding. She remembered her bag, wondering if there might be some rags in it. Cordelia quickly threw her cloak to the ground and pulled out her bag from underneath it, searching for some fabric in it that could help her with the bandage. After all, her search hadn't been in vain. The girl was quite pleased with herself when she finally found a scrap of cloth in her bag that could be used to bandage the Duke's wound. Besides this scrap of paper, there were other things in the bag, among which was her simple and unpretentious doll, which she did not want to leave in the house of its former owner. The little girl immediately began administering first aid to the wounded man. She used a rag she found as a bandage and bandaged the bleeding wound on his stomach. She liked her work. In the end, she seemed to have managed to stop the bleeding, and the tissue was enough to at least somewhat alleviate the Duke's suffering. The girl looked again at the Duke lying in front of her and thought with hope that he would definitely thank her for this, because for him it should be just some small thing. She didn't think she should expect any reward in the form of gold or jewels. She asked for only one thing: compassion. A little compassion, thinking about what awaited her in the future from this man. She would very much like to hope that in the future, when she finds herself tied hand and foot in front of this man, he will remember the service she rendered and save her life in return for her deed. She remembered the wealth she had recently acquired, pulled out her wallet, and thought that this money should save her right now. She was pleased with herself, since she had become rich quite unexpectedly, and thought that she was even worthy of a small payment in return for saving this man. A moment later, something else caught the girl's attention. When she glanced at the man lying before her, she noticed something shiny peeking out from under his shirt at the neck, looking very much like a piece of jewelry. She thought about what it could be, took the shiny chain in her hands, and thought that she would hardly be able to get a large sum for it, but why not collect it? At the end of the chain was an identical sparkling pendant. Although it looked little like jewelry, it could still be put to some use. She was very interested in the thing she had found, and taking it in her hands, she began to examine this pendant. As it turned out, it wasn't broken at all. It was simply designed to be used to hide something. And now, the girl discovered a lock of hair inside. Indeed, it looked very much like someone's lock of hair. She also thought that this thing must be very important to the young man. So she decided to leave it here, so he would immediately notice it if it were to disappear. Cordelia sat down next to the man and began to reflect. She thought about how saints heal people, and now, perhaps, after her actions, she too would be called a saint. She decided they were well hidden in this secluded spot. Since she was tired, she decided to get some sleep. Besides, the illness wasn't going away. It was the thought of rest that finally won out within the poor little runaway. The place turned out to be a rather old, abandoned building, with some crates stacked against the walls. It looked like no one had been there for a long time. The girl decided that nothing bad would happen if she lay down and slept, even for a little while. Accustomed as she was to the harsh conditions of life, she lay down on the wooden floor and closed her eyes, an overwhelming desire to get some sleep. After some time, she opened her eyes and began to listen to the rumors around her. She seemed to have forgotten where she was and began to recall the recent events that had happened to her. In the end, she managed to remember everything, and she thought that she had finally managed to fall asleep and at least rested a little from the adventure that had happened to her. The girl was literally speechless after hearing a voice behind her. She couldn't see who was behind her, but that person was now loudly asking the girl who she was. She was terribly scared and thought that he had finally woken up after she looked behind her and saw the young man, who was now conscious and carefully studying the little girl. The young Duke continued to look at her, awaiting an answer to his question. He couldn't understand how he had ended up in this abandoned house, or who this child was who was now beside her. Cordelia decided she had nothing to hide for now, and it wouldn't hurt to tell the Duke she was the one who saved him. She also wondered if the man had noticed the money was missing. The Duke looked at her closely and, unexpectedly for her, asked the girl if she was Rosalind's daughter. The girl could not understand what was being said, and when she asked who Rosalind was, the Duke said that, well, then he would ask her in a different way. The girl was literally stunned and speechless by the young man's question about whether her name was Cordelia. She couldn't understand how he had learned her name, so she declared that she'd never heard such a name before. And while she continued to think fruitlessly about how the Duke could have found out this, the young man again asked her what her name was then. The girl replied that she didn't have a name. It didn't matter at all, and he simply needed to remember her face. She would very much like him to remember her face and recall it sometime in the future, at that moment when she would sit in front of him, bound hand and foot. She looked at the Duke and thought that she wished he would remember her as the child who saved him back then. Just remember that and not ask her name. The young man approached the girl, lifted her head slightly by the chin, and said that she had Rosalind's eyes. The girl thought she had heard this somewhere before, and it seemed very familiar to her. Cordelia thought this couldn't be just a coincidence. More likely, this was what was about to decide her fate. Though not right now. Rosalind was, because she was the heroine from the book. She was probably the one the Duke was talking about now, and she was the saint's mother. It was an affectionate abbreviation for the Duke of Valencia's first love. Her name was Rose. The girl remembered that this was exactly the case. It was mentioned at the very beginning of the book, and she could not forget it for a number of reasons. Rosalind was a fallen noblewoman imbued with divine powers. She married Oryx's second son to regain her status, but this woman's fate turned tragic. As soon as her daughter turned 3, everything ended in tragedy. Someone attacked Rosalind, and she died, but that wasn't all. Besides the woman's death, another mysterious event occurred. Her child disappeared without a trace. Duke of Valencia was fatally wounded by a hired assassin while searching for the baby. The book says the saint discovered him by chance and healed him with divine power. When the Duke saw her face, something incredible happened. He instantly realized she was Rosalind's daughter. But now, the girl was only thinking about how she wasn't a saint, but someone else. And at the moment when the Duke said that one way or another the girl was her and he knew it, she broke free from his embrace and said that this was absolutely not true. The girl immediately told the Duke standing before her that she was completely different from what he thought she was. She began to explain to him that he was mistaken in mistaking her for someone else. The young man looked at her carefully. The girl really hoped he would believe her words about it not being her. She repeated this over and over until she finally grew tired. The Duke looked at her again and said that perhaps it was true, but he still felt that she knew something and was not telling him the whole truth. This even angered her. She shouted loudly that this was not so, and she could not help him in any way. Then the girl realized that she was unable to convince this man in any way, but she still said that she knew nothing and that this could not be changed in any way. The next moment, their argument stopped because the girl standing next to the man grabbed his hand and began to pull him towards her. She tried to direct him behind the boxes standing nearby, and therefore pulled the man by the hand and urged him to move quickly after her. She succeeded in doing so, and finally both the young man and the Duke's little companion hid in this room behind a pile of some rubbish. The man tried to ask her what was going on and why she suddenly decided to hide with him, but his little companion immediately ordered him to bend down so that he could not be seen, and then began to cover his mouth with her palm. She mentally urged him to be quiet. She didn't want to be caught now, and therefore she needed to behave more quietly so that they would not be noticed by the 2 men who entered this abandoned house. Cordelia continued to cover the man's mouth, fearing that he might give her away with his words or loud breathing. And then those who entered would discover their presence here. Perhaps they were noticed after all, because one of the men standing nearby asked the other whether he had heard any strange sounds, or if he had just imagined it. They huddled behind a pile of junk piled up in the house and tried to remain as quiet as possible. Meanwhile, the men continued to talk among themselves. One of the men told the other not to deny it, as he thought he was the one who farted and was just trying to change the subject. The other replied that since he liked it so much, wouldn't he like him to fart in his mouth? The girl thought these voices were very familiar. She wondered if one of them could really be Humphrey. She knew that her former mistress, from whom she had decided to escape today, could not stand cigarettes, and therefore, when her employees wanted to have a smoke, they came to this abandoned house. Continuing to cover the Duke's mouth with her palms, the girl kept thinking that since the mistress had been in a bad mood lately, perhaps they would not come here, and then no one would notice her presence in this house. She continued to close her companion's mouth with all her might, thinking that he should obey her and not move. Otherwise, the mistress might find out that they were hiding here. The Duke didn't put up much of a fight, but then he pointed his finger at the palms of his hands near his mouth, apparently showing the girl that he was already finding it difficult to breathe. She looked at him and guessed that he was probably having trouble breathing, and perhaps, since he realized the danger of the situation, she could loosen her grip. The girl immediately let go of her hands and moved them aside. She suddenly realized that she had almost killed this man with her actions. He seemed quite stunned by this, too. He stared intently at the child who had just covered his mouth, trying to figure out what was happening. But the next moment, the Duke grabbed the girl's hand and showed her that everything was all right. He wanted to support her and show her that he was on her side and could protect her. When he took the girl's hand, he was surprised to notice that it looked rather unusual. Bruises were visible where the elbow bends, likely from some unknown injections. The man was shocked. He realized they were probably injection marks. He couldn't understand who would do this to a little girl or why. At this point, something caught the attention of one of the men smoking in the house. He looked closely at the floor and began to wonder where the object he saw there might be familiar from. A doll abandoned by the girl lay at their feet, and the man suddenly asked what kind of junk it was. The other man replied that it was a doll, just a doll, and asked him if he was blind. Then, one of the people who came casually picked up the doll that belonged to the girl and said that it was just some rag, and then asked if it wasn't the doll of a little girl named Cordelia. After that, he started looking around and talking loudly about why she was there. Come to think of it, he hadn't seen this girl today. Maybe she decided to run away, but who knows where. He noticed some barrels standing in the corner and thought that perhaps that's where she was hiding. He told his companion that, in any case, the girl would soon be found and then beaten to death. The little girl listened intently to the conversation between two men who had wandered in by chance. She heard them clearly and began to tremble with fear. After all, if they caught her here now, without money and flowers, it was quite clear what would happen to her. She knew very well what happened to children who tried to disobey their mistress. In that case, she would have definitely had every bone broken, just like that girl who once tried to escape. She was terrified. She couldn't control herself and continued to tremble. The girl thought that now her friend, the one who had suffered, could only drag her feet, unable to do anything but beg. If she had enough now, she would suffer the same fate. She was so immersed in her thoughts and emotions that she didn't notice the man's hand reaching out to her. It seemed he wanted to do something to her. She immediately came to her senses and was slightly distracted from her heavy thoughts at the moment when the hand of the man sitting next to her touched the top of her head. The Duke realized the girl was very frightened. He told her she shouldn't worry about anything, and that now was not the time to think about it. Then he asked her to cover her ears. The girl looked questioningly at the man, unsure what he wanted from her. Yet she had no choice but to trust him in this difficult moment. After this, Cordelia closed her eyes, raised her hands up, intending to fulfill the young man's request. The girl crouched down in the corner behind a box of junk, tucked her legs under her, and covered her ears tightly with her palms. The Duke looked at her thoughtfully and attentively. He seemed a little taken aback by how quickly the girl agreed to his request. He was even more surprised by how frightened she seemed. After this, the young man smiled and slowly rose to his full height, a slight smile appearing on his lips. The man emerged from the hiding place where he had been hiding with the little girl and approached two men in the building, asking if he had imagined they had called the child by the name Cordelia and asked if they knew the girl. One of the men looked questioningly at the stranger who had appeared out of nowhere. He couldn't figure out who he was or what he was doing in a place where there were usually no strangers. The second one wasn't so silent. He became a little frightened and loudly asked the Duke who the hell he was and what he was doing here. The man thought it looked like some idiot about to die. He noticed the wound on the Duke's stomach and asked him if even if they knew who the girl was, what would happen next, and why should it matter to him? The Duke did not hesitate to answer and said that he had one matter for her, adding that it was a very old matter. After this, the young man said he'd been looking for this girl for 5 years. Then came sighs and gasps, and calls to beat her. Cordelia heard none of this. She continued to sit in her secluded spot, covering her ears with her hands, hoping that everything would end well for her in the end. The girl kept repeating to herself that everything would be fine, and everything would be all right. She had no choice but to trust this man and wait for a happy ending. The girl seemed to hear light screams that were heard near her, but suddenly the screams stopped, and a sharp smell of blood reached her. She was still afraid to open her ears and open her eyes, afraid that two men could overcome one wounded man on whom all her hope lay. She felt the boards beneath her feet begin to vibrate, and from their trembling, the girl realized that someone was coming. She really didn't want it to be Humphrey. It seemed she had no choice but to open her eyes and free her ears to make sure that, fortunately for her, everything was all right. The girl raised her eyes and looked ahead. As she had secretly hoped, everything turned out well for her. The young Duke approached her, sat down next to her, and began stroking her head. Cordelia froze immediately. No one had ever stroked her head before, and this sensation was completely new and unfamiliar to her. At the same time, she felt a strange, pleasant warmth in her belly. The Duke sighed heavily, and then sat down next to the little girl. He asked her how she had ended up in this orphanage. The girl immediately froze in fear. She wondered what this meant and how the man could have known about it. She asked him what he was talking about. The Duke replied that he had seen her escape from there. These memories were very difficult for the girl, and she didn't even want to think about them. She felt absolutely terrible in the orphanage, and she hated these people. They were abused in that shelter, and she never felt truly free. For as long as she could remember, shelter staff regularly drew blood from them. She even began to feel as if the children at the orphanage served only one purpose: to supply blood to the nuns working there. She couldn't understand the purpose of all this. The girl remembered that on that very day, she ran so fast, it seemed like everyone in the orphanage was chasing her. But she didn't want to talk about it, because if the man found out, he would definitely take her for a saint. But it seems he did not need any facts, just as he did not need her answer, because the Duke said that she was the daughter of Rosalind, and the girl who was the saint. She immediately began to loudly object to him, repeating again that she was no saint, that she had no mother, and that the young man should stop being so stubborn. When the Duke said that she had too intelligent a mind for a child of 6 or 7, the girl immediately screamed loudly and declared that she was 8 years old. After the Duke asked how she knew her age, she shouted at him that she knew it from the people at the orphanage. The next moment, she realized she'd gotten too nervous and said something unnecessary. She immediately covered her mouth with her hand, but it was too late, and she managed to admit that she'd once been in an orphanage. Cordelia immediately turned back so that the Duke could not see her facial expression, and began mentally calling herself a fool and an idiot. She realized she had likely fallen into the man's cleverly laid trap and thus exposed herself. Now all she could do was watch him from under her brows and await his decision. The Duke remained seated, oblivious to the emotion on the girl's face. He merely invited her to come with him. He promised to adopt her and become her guardian. The girl stopped abruptly. She hadn't expected this turn of events at all. She'd hoped to simply disappear from this city and have no future ties to either the saint or this man's family. She asked the man what would happen if, perhaps, a true saint were to appear. Would he really be ready to throw her out into the street? As if nothing had happened, the young man replied that this would never happen. She would still remain his daughter. She thought the Duke was a real liar when he told her that he was only looking for Rosalind's daughter and did not need the saint. Unlike the Duke, she was well aware of the book's plot, and according to her, he needed the saint, because with her help, he could gain strength. The girl knew that this was what was written in that book about the future, but she couldn't tell the man this, and so she demanded a direct answer from him, whether he simply needed a girl who could pretend to be a saint. She was a little taken aback by the man's response, who said that she had guessed correctly and that he was indeed looking for a child whom he could present as a saint. Duke von Valencia looked closely at the face of his interlocutor and asked her if this would suit her, and if she would agree to become his daughter. Without thinking twice, Cordelia replied that she would never agree to this. She thought again about the time she spent in the shelter she hated. Because of it, many things she hated had appeared in her life. And it all started with those needles. Her life was simply unbearable. She was constantly afraid of beatings and hunger strikes at the shelter. There were many other things she didn't even want to remember, but there was still something else the girl hated even more. She told the man that she hated pretending to be someone more than anything in the world. The young man took something from behind his back and held it out towards the girl, who immediately recognized the thing in the man's hand. She recognized her doll and picked it up. It was her only toy, and she wouldn't want to lose it for anything in the world. The Duke told her to think about her answer. If she agreed, he would give her the most beautiful doll and a bunch of new clothes. The girl raised her head and looked into the Duke's eyes as he informed her that it was absolutely impossible that she was not the saint, and that she was not the girl he had been looking for so long. She hugged her doll to her chest and thought that the man took her for a saint, and that was the only reason he was saying all these words. But perhaps it was still worth taking advantage of it. The girl said that if the Duke had a stable in his house, he could not leave more hay for her if she agreed to his proposal. The Duke replied that there was no need for that. She would have her own room. And when the girl asked if there would be a comfortable bed, he replied that, naturally, and that the bed would be large enough for her to run and jump on. When the Duke asked her what else she wanted, The girl replied that she wanted warm food, not scraps. The Duke replied that he would prepare whatever she desired. The girl stood there, wondering if she had been too hasty in accepting the offer. She still feared it might lead her to the end described in the book. The young man remained seated. He said he wouldn't rush the girl's answer, but he would still very much like her to agree, and if so, he was prepared to fulfill any of her conditions. Cordelia decided to ask him something anyway. She asked him what would happen if it turned out that her mother wasn't the woman named Rosalind, but someone else. She looked into the stunned man's face and asked what he would do in that case and whether she would regret her decision. The girl asked again what would happen if she wasn't the woman's real daughter. What would she do then? After all, she was a true saint, such a divinely beautiful girl who, like no one else, deserved the title of saint. The girl knew the saint was like an angel, with a pure and innocent soul, and everyone loved her. So she asked the Duke if his real daughter would probably be more humble and beautiful than her. The man didn't hesitate to answer. He said he didn't care whether the girl was a saint or not, but he was certain she was Rosalind's daughter, and so he should stop stubbornly trying to prove otherwise. When the girl asked the young man how he could be so confident, he replied that he had never made a mistake and was now completely confident in his words. The girl waited to hear what he would say, and the man said that if it suddenly turned out that she was not Rosalind's daughter, nothing would change radically. He pointed his index finger in his direction and said that it would be just his fault and his mistake, and the responsibility for this decision would also be his. The girl had a very difficult time making this choice. She certainly wanted to try a comfortable life, but she didn't want to take any risks. Every thought and emotion that was currently swirling within the little child could be seen on her face. It seemed as if a whole hurricane of passions was raging within her. She suddenly grabbed her head and began twisting it left and right, as if she were dizzy. When the man asked her what she was doing, the girl replied that she was trying to get her thoughts in order and needed a cool head. But that wasn't all. Despite knowing the answer beforehand, the girl still asked the man if he was her father, and the Duke replied that her father had disappeared and that he was simply fulfilling her mother's request. The man stopped short and abruptly fell silent after the girl asked him about the relationship between him and the girl's mother. It seemed that this question even upset him because he suddenly bit his lip and turned his head in the direction opposite to his interlocutor. The girl eagerly awaited an answer to her question and heard that the man and her mother were just best friends. She began to look closely at the man and also recalled what had happened just recently on the street. Back then, her current interlocutor had been delirious, and his words had not escaped her attention. Holding the girl to his chest, the man said that if he falls to his knees before you, I will fall after him. If he crawls like a little dog, I will do the same at your command. The girl remembered that in his delirium, he had demanded that she say that she loved him and not someone else, and therefore she was sure that the Duke still loved that woman. The girl decided that there was still something that needed to be sorted out, and so she asked the Duke to promise her something. When the man asked what he had to promise, Cordelia replied that even if it turned out that she was not a saint and not Rosalind's daughter, he would not kill her. The young man looked closely at the girl. He realized he still knew this child very little. He thought she was just a tiny creature, but as it turned out, she had been through many trials and tribulations and reasoned like an adult. He saw that the girl standing in front of him was trembling with fear, and it became clear to him that, despite even her outward stubbornness, she was afraid that he would kill her right then and there. Whatever one might say, he needed to find a way out of this situation if he wanted this child to be with him. So, the man extended his hand welcomingly toward the girl. She made no response, so the young man continued to sit on the floor with his hand outstretched. And then he said that his name was Alessandro Valencia. The girl listened silently to her interlocutor. The man said that on behalf of his entire Valencia clan, he swears he will not kill her. The man extended his hand toward the girl, and traces of blood were visible on his palm. But the girl didn't seem at all frightened. She extended her hand in response and said that she did not have a name, but she would let him know as soon as she had one. The man immediately pulled his hand back, squeezed his fingers a little, and said that this was the real problem. He pretended to be as thoughtful as possible and said that in order for the adoption process to be official, the girl must have a name. Without it, nothing could be done. The girl asked the man in surprise if this meant he wouldn't adopt her. When the man told her that she simply needed to choose a new name and that he would like to name her after who she had become as his daughter, The girl replied that she did not like the name Cordelia at all. She was very surprised by how easily the man agreed with her arguments and said that they would immediately exclude this name. The man looked at his palm in surprise after the girl said that his entire palm was covered in blood. Cordelia immediately turned around to look for something. She said she had no more fabric, and now they didn't know what to do. She immediately began examining the interior of the building they were in. She needed to find some kind of rag to bandage the Duke's hand, but she couldn't get far. A young man rushed after her, grabbed the girl, and covered her eyes with his palm. After this, with a light movement of his hand, he grabbed the girl by the waist. When he grabbed the girl in his arms and stood up to his full height with her, the man said that he could smell a rose coming from her, to which she immediately objected that there was only blood everywhere. The man repeated just one word, Rosaria, several times, and then added that the name Rosaria suited the girl very well. The girl, who was comfortably seated on the Duke's arm, also repeated the name and said that it was excellent, and she also liked the name. Suddenly, there was a knock. A gold coin fell onto the floorboard and rolled across the floor. Following her, other shiny metal coins flew to the Duke's feet, hitting each other with a ringing sound. The young man looked down in surprise, trying to understand what had happened and where the money had fallen from. To his surprise, there were several shiny gold coins lying at the young man's feet, which had clearly just fallen out of nowhere. At that moment, the girl, clinging to his shoulder, was thinking of only one thing. She realized that the coins from the Duke's purse had spilled out, and she wondered if she should run away right then. And while the Duke was pondering the origin of the fallen coins, the girl thought that, although this man was a duke, just one blow to the wound could knock all the spirit out of him. But then everything changed when the girl saw blood on the man's temple hair. When she told him there was blood there, the man asked if it was true and said he didn't remember hitting his head anywhere. Cordelia took a close look at the wound on the young man's head and said that that, too, would need to be addressed somehow. The Duke touched his forehead with his hand and said that he must have hit it somewhere, although it was strange that he didn't remember anything about it. The girl speculated on what might have caused the injury. She recalled dragging the Duke along the cobblestone street and thought she must have accidentally bumped him on the way to the abandoned house. She decided that while she was dragging him, the man might have hit the stone wall or steps near the house. She was very upset and thought that if the Duke realized this, she would definitely be finished, and she really wanted to say that it was not her. But her cry was cut off mid-sentence when the man unexpectedly thanked her, and the girl immediately asked why. The young man hugged the girl tightly to his body and said that it was she who had helped him, and asked her if that wasn't true. The girl asked him if he was going to scold her. She couldn't notice that at that moment the bodies of two uninvited guests lay sprawled at their feet. All her thoughts were preoccupied with the fact that if the Duke noticed she had done something she shouldn't have, it would mean the end for her. After Cordelia asked her companion if he wanted to collect the coins and promised to help him, he replied that Valencias do not kneel without a good reason, and she should remember this, since she was now also part of the clan. The girl remembered the words the young man had whispered to her while he was delirious. He said that if he fell on his knees before you, I would fall with him. She remembered again how he had whispered in his unconscious state that if he crawled like a little dog at her command, he would crawl just like that too. She really wanted to tell him he was lying. It was already a deep, moonlit night when the passions connected with the Duke and his little savior gradually subsided, and everything was arranged. Somehow, the Duke managed to arrange for a carriage to be sent from his palace for them, and now it was slowly moving towards his home. There was also a little girl inside the carriage. She was worried about today's events and sat quietly, hugging her doll. She was very tired from the events of the day and was no longer at all surprised that the young man she had saved put his hand on her head to stroke it again. After some time, sleep overcame her, and the girl comfortably placed her head on the lap of the Duke, who was sitting next to her in the carriage. On the Duke's orders, the coachman drove rather slowly so that the carriage would not sway on turns and bumps. But this journey, too, finally came to an end, and when the Duke was informed that they had already arrived, he got out of his carriage. The man, meanwhile, continued to hold the pleasant burden in his arms. He didn't wake the girl, but she woke up on her own when they exited the carriage. Cordelia asked the Duke to let her go. She said she was already 8 years old and could walk on her own, to which he immediately replied that she would be released as soon as they entered the house. The girl became curious about where they had arrived. She began to turn her head from side to side, intending to get to know the place where this man lived. She had never seen such splendor and luxury in her life. If the Duke had called this building a home, The girl believed he was very much mistaken, for it was a true palace, impressive in its size and luxury. The only thing Cordelia could say was an admiring exclamation of, "Wow!" They continued moving, and when a young man came forward and asked the Duke where the hell he had been, he replied that he had needed to find someone, and it seemed he had finally completed this difficult task. The young man who approached him appeared very agitated. He asked the Duke why he had left alone, and inquired about this irresponsible behavior. The man's feelings were genuine. He said the Duke should have at least warned him. The man holding the girl in his arms replied that they could talk about this a little later, but now was not the time for lectures. After this, he lowered his burden to the ground and said that this girl should be taken care of. The young man immediately began examining her, without uttering a sound. It seemed his attention was occupied by studying the small child who had appeared in the palace. In his opinion, this child was some kind of commoner, dressed in tattered rags and, what's more, holding an ugly, simple doll in her hands. The girl looked unkempt and frightened. The young man remained silent, his eyes never leaving the child. He couldn't understand what had suddenly occurred to his master. Then, with a strange expression on his face, he pointed his index finger towards the girl standing next to her and asked the Duke what was this. His master's expression immediately changed. He turned his head slightly towards him and ordered him not to dare point his fingers. The young man's finger immediately began to slowly bend back after his master told him not to dare point his finger at his daughter. These words literally stunned the young man. He froze in place, and only his eyes revealed the profound thought process going on within him. The only word that escaped his lips again was, "What?" And then it seemed as if the Duke's palace was swimming before his eyes. He received no answer to this question because the Duke walked with a determined step towards the front door of the palace, and his servant continued to ask about the mother of this girl and inquired whether this was why the Duke had postponed the wedding. The young man looked sideways at the girl and told his master that she looked strange and just like the dead son of the Oryx family. After this, a loud roar was heard from the Duke, who shouted that these were too loud words. After this, the young man fell silent and began to think about whether he had drawn the correct conclusions from his observations. Then he hurried after his master and asked him if he had stolen the child in whom the blood of Oryx flowed. The Duke of Valencia replied that there was no need to make anything up, and that it was just an abandoned child that he had picked up on the street. The girl hurried after the Duke, pressed herself against his leg, and listened to the words of the young man, who said that the Duke admitted the fact of the theft and seemed to have completely lost his head. The man stroked the girl's head again and called her by her name, Rose. When the girl raised her eyes to him and asked him what he wanted to tell her, the Duke loudly announced that it was Rosaria von Valencia. After that, he added that he was going to include the girl standing next to him in his family tree, and that was all his servant needed to know. The young man was simply stunned. He couldn't believe what he had just heard and looked in bewilderment at the gentleman and the girl he had found on the street. He seemed to be completely speechless, but then, clearing his throat slightly, he just asked one word. "What?" and then added, "What?" he said. The ducal palace witnessed a young man ask his master if he was crazy to suddenly bring in some girl and decide to make her part of the family. And not just any girl, but Oryx's child. In ancient times, Oryx and Valencia were at odds with each other even before the strife of the gods, and to this day, hostility has persisted between these noble courts. The Duke addressed the young man, calling him by his name, Simon, and said that he should not shout in front of the child. The young man, who still wanted to answer him, immediately froze mid-sentence and suddenly realized that his persuasion would lead to nothing. It seemed the palace's master was simply implacable. He moved silently along the palace corridor, ignoring the words of the young man following him. He walked a little behind and watched him intently, wondering if this was really the Duke he knew. An elderly woman came out to meet them, sighed heavily, began to ooh and ah, and said just a few words. "Oh God." She told the Duke that she heard some noise and immediately came here to find out what was going on. The owner of the house told the woman, named Emma, that she was just in time. He added that he had to go now and was counting on the woman to take care of the girl. The woman leaned towards the girl again and said the same phrase. "Oh God!" She smiled at the small, wary young lady and called her Pretty Lady. Emma smiled all the time, wanting to win the young guest over as best she could. Cordelia thought that all these words sounded somehow ridiculous, and it hardly resembled a true compliment. And besides, There seemed to her a lot of falseness in it. As they walked further up the steps, the woman asked the Duke if his wounds needed to be treated, but he replied that there was no need to worry and that he had already been helped with that, although he still thought it was worth changing his clothes. The young man told his maid to prepare for the girl whatever she wanted, and she should be given the largest room. The woman said that she would carry out his request and asked the owner if this was not his room. The Duke replied that if this was indeed the case, and the largest room belonged to him, then the girl should be placed there. Simon, who was walking next to them, one could easily read bewilderment at his master's order. The maid looked rather distressed. She couldn't understand why her master had decided to give up his quarters. The little guest of the palace was also surprised by the fact that she would be living in a room that belonged to the Duke. Simon was the first to lose his temper and asked his master if he was serious. The man replied that he had done this quite deliberately, and then thought for a moment, and said that he thought they should also change the decor of the room. The girl extended her hand to the Duke at the moment when he ordered the list to be left in his library, and first ordered that he find out what the young lady liked. Cordelia looked into the Duke's face and asked if he was leaving again, and inquired where he was going. The young man leaned slightly towards her and informed her that he needed to do something so that she could officially become his daughter, and therefore he still had a lot of work to do. The young man knelt down next to the girl, began stroking her head, and promised that everything would be ready by tomorrow. He asked her not to salt the property and to stay home. When the girl told the man that she never got into trouble, he asked her if she was probably just hiding. The girl said nothing and merely lowered her gaze slightly. She still couldn't calm down. She was sure she wasn't the girl the young man had been searching for so long. She was a completely different person. The girl was sure that she was definitely not the saint that the Duke wanted to find. It was with these thoughts that she went to bed in her new place. Everything in the ducal palace fell silent, and by the middle of the night, not a single sound could be heard inside. But not everyone had gone to bed yet. The girl and the servants accompanying her continued their journey down the long corridor. An elderly woman walked in front. Their young guest walked quietly next to her, and a little behind walked the young man who had greeted her so unfriendly in the palace. Emma leaned over to her little companion and asked her if she could find out her name. The girl raised her head up to the woman leaning towards her and told her that her name was Rosaria. When the woman began to say that her name was as beautiful as her features, the girl began to wonder if her face was actually ugly, and whether that meant that the woman also considered her name to be terrible. A young man walked slowly behind the woman and the girl. He too was lost in his own thoughts, wondering what kind of person this little rascal might be. Simon paused, wondering if he couldn't learn anything about the girl, knowing her age. He knew she was 6, and he knew there were no children that age in the Oryx family. Since the man had voiced his thoughts out loud, the girl, having heard that she was 6 years old, immediately turned her head in his direction and declared that she was not 6, but 8 years old. The young man continued to reflect, meaning that she was 8 years old, and probably some events that could shed light on the personality of this girl occurred 8 years ago. The woman walking next to the young woman also became thoughtful. She, too, began to wonder what could have happened 8 years ago, and whether it was somehow connected to their master. The three of them continued down the palace corridor, their minds preoccupied with thoughts. Each was busy analyzing what they'd heard, or wondering what it could mean. At some point, the young man smiled slightly, as if an unexpected thought had occurred to him, and said that this was real madness. Then he thought, this is complete nonsense after all. Even if her name is Rosaria, it's probably shortened to Rose. The man grabbed his head and decided that he was simply going crazy, and this could only be real madness. The girl listened to his muttering, not understanding what the matter could be. She really wanted to know what the man walking behind them was thinking at that moment. She became curious about the meaning of such behavior of their companion, and so she turned to the maid walking next to her and asked what was wrong with him. Ima answered the girl that everything was fine with him and it was not worth her concern. The girl didn't feel that way at all. She immediately noticed how hostile this young man was towards her when they met. It seemed Simon didn't like her at all. Looking at this man, she saw that he treated her with hostility. She even thought that perhaps he truly hated her. Eventually, they reached the room where the girl was supposed to spend the night. They found a dress for her that was clearly too big for her. It likely belonged to an older woman. Now she was sitting in a chair, and the maid brought her a plate of soup, which immediately caused a feeling of acute hunger inside the girl. Standing next to her, Emma smiled again and told the girl that she heard that she had been fasting for a whole week, so she should start with light food. When the girl asked her if the plate was for her, The woman replied that of course it was, and that she would not eat it. After this, the woman began to watch the girl, who still had not picked up a spoon and had not started eating. Still looking at the bowl of soup in front of her, the girl said that the mistress used to say that children like her were too pathetic to have money and eat at someone else's expense. She wondered if she should eat it. After all, if she ate something expensive and delicious, she would never be pitied again. And if she wasn't pitied, her life would change again. Emma was struck by the words of this poor child, who had been hungry for so long and now also couldn't bring herself to eat. After all, the girl said that eventually she would end up on the street again and have nothing to eat. She didn't know what to do in this situation. The girl sat silently, afraid to even touch food, and she didn't know how she could help her. Emma couldn't even imagine what this poor child had gone through. She couldn't understand how she could restrain herself and starve now, even though she had been just as hungry for the past few months. But it seemed the woman had decided to do something. She didn't say a word to the child, but abruptly knelt down in front of her. Kneeling in front of the girl sitting in the chair, Emma said that she had nothing to worry about and promised that today and tomorrow the girl would eat her fill, because she was born a human and needed to eat human food. Looking at the poor child's face, the old woman said that this should not be the case and that children should never do the work of adults. The girl listened to her attentively, and the maid added that she would never have to worry about survival again. Taking the girl by the hand, the woman smiled at her and told her that she needed to eat a lot, sleep well, and grow up healthy. Cordelia kept her eyes fixed on the woman and listened intently. She thought she was some strange old woman, but she really wanted to believe her words. After the girl had eaten her bowl of soup, she decided to get off the chair and discovered that the hem of her dress was dragging on the floor. She looked questioningly at the woman, showing her the hanging sleeves, and the maid explained to her that this dress had been worn by Mrs. Ingrid when she was little, and it seemed to be completely out of size for the girl. The woman then added that if she had known earlier that it might be useful, she would have handled it especially carefully. Besides, she thought Mr. Julian would also be pleased, since it reminded him of his mother. The girl stood up to remember, and the thought came to her that Ingrid seemed to be the name of the Duke's sister. As she knew from the book's plot, this was the name of one of the novel's heroines, and she also belonged to this ducal family. When the girl questioningly uttered the woman's name, Julian, she explained that he was Mrs. Ingrid's son and that he was being treated there. She also advised the girl not to be too surprised if she saw him. The last words sounded somehow strange, and so Cordelia asked her why she shouldn't be surprised. The woman replied that the young man was very seriously ill. He spent much of his time in his room and often did not leave it. Unfortunately, his treatment does not bring any results, since a very strong curse has been placed on him, and so far no one has been able to cure the boy of his illness. That is why the curse makes him feel bad, and in addition, his behavior is also different from his other peers. Emma did not explain anything more, but simply repeated her words that there was no need to be surprised if they suddenly met, and the girl replied that she understood everything well. At this time, the girl's thoughts were preoccupied with analyzing the information she had just received. So, the Duke of Valencia's sister was, it seemed, the prince's mother, and perhaps his name was Julian. The emperor had an illegitimate son with the woman he loved. When Ingrid died, he ordered that the woman be given the title of empress. But the emperor's actions didn't stop there. He apparently made that woman's son a prince and the rightful heir to his throne. And yet, if she understood correctly, the saint loved him. Despite the saint helping Julian break free from the curse, the prince remained indifferent to her. This woman's thoughts were occupied with something entirely different. The girl thought for a couple more seconds, and then decided that all this was not worth her attention, and in any case, she should not meet the prince. At some point, the woman and her little companion entered a room that looked simply luxurious. Its furnishings were rich and elegant, and there was a huge bed. With her mouth open, the girl began to look in surprise at everything that was inside the room, and asked the woman if this room was really hers. Emma just smiled when she heard her words, and said that, in her opinion, this room was not ideal for a little lady. But the girl seemed to be wearing blinders. She refused to even consider that anything could be wrong, and she saw no flaws. It was already deep night when the girl finally reached her bedroom. A bright moon shone outside, and soft light also fell from the lamps on the walls. The elderly maid put the girl to bed, covered her carefully with a blanket, and said that she must be very tired, and therefore she should quickly fall asleep. After this, She leaned over the lying girl, kissed her on the forehead, and wished her sweet dreams. When the little lady asked the maid what it was, the woman replied that it was just a drop of magic to make her have good dreams. The woman was simply stunned by what happened next. The little girl reached out to her and did something the woman never expected. She grabbed the maid's body, hugged her, touched her cheek with her lips, and wished her sweet dreams too, to which the woman only responded, "Oh my God!" Maida. As she was leaving the room, Emma told her little mistress that, thanks to her, she would definitely have a wonderful night, and thanked her for it. Finally, the light in the room was turned off, and the girl was left completely alone in her bedroom, and, thanks to the moonlight coming through the window, she was able to properly examine the walls and ceiling of this room. She lay in her bed, only her head poking out from under the covers, thinking about how drastically her fate had changed today. So many things had happened today that seemed completely impossible to happen to her. Cordelia closed her eyes, trying to sleep. She felt completely exhausted, overcome by the emotions that literally overwhelmed her. She was also troubled by the thought of whether she had the right to be in this place. The next day, quite a few strange events occurred in the capital. A large number of unidentified bodies were found in a back alley. As it later turned out, it was Madame Pamel's group, who often took advantage of orphans' plight to make money and abuse these poor children. But that wasn't all. Something even stranger happened. No one could understand how it was that only the bodies of adults were found. There was no trace left of the children in that group. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. The little guest at the ducal palace was completely unaware of what was happening outside. She enjoyed her stay in this house, having already forgotten her previous life. She basked in her soft, enormous bed, not even thinking about waking up. For the first time in her life, she was fortunate enough to sleep as much as she pleased, and so she decided to take the liberty of lying on her comfortable bed. The girl tossed and turned, not trying to open her eyes. She was no longer asleep, but she still wanted to feel the softness of this bed for as long as possible. She hugged her pillow and thought it was pure happiness. She loved everything she saw in this palace, and the bed was incredibly comfortable. Finally, she had to open her eyes, and she was simply stunned by what she saw. Her face and eyes expressed genuine fear, and the girl was ready to scream in terror. She stared at the object she saw next to her, unable to comprehend what it was. Never in her life had she seen anything like it, and now she tried in vain to calm her emotions. The Duke, who at that time was in a completely different place, far from the room of his little pet, was literally dumbfounded when he heard her loud scream. The girl lifted the hem of her dress and ran towards the young man, trying to protect herself as quickly as possible from the terrible sight she had seen. When she ran up to the young man, she immediately grabbed his knees with both hands. She looked into his face with her huge, frightened eyes and repeated only one word, repeating that there was a head there. Holding tightly to the Duke's legs with both hands, the girl repeated to him that there was a head in her room and that it was also looking at her. Following the girl, Simone and the living maid came here, who said that she just wanted to ask why the lady was so scared, as she immediately ran away to the master. The young man, hearing the word head, said that perhaps the girl was referring to the stuffed animal that hung in the Duke's room. He immediately fell silent after the Duke told him that this was no longer his room, and it was time to remember that. The young man told the gentleman that he was right, and he would not make such a mistake again. When the girl asked what the word scarecrow meant, the Duke replied that people do not bury dead animals, but stuff them with cotton wool, making something like dolls. When the little lady asked him how one could keep such things in one's bedroom, the Duke replied that it was a promise, since the white horse represented the departed head of the family. EMMA said that it was time to end this conversation, and added to the Duke that, in her opinion, it was not worth telling the young lady something like that. The Duke replied that since the girl had asked, he should answer. The Oryx were a righteous family, and their symbol was a horse working under the scorching sun. Unlike this family, the Valencia genus is associated by many people with something dark and illegal, although this is not true, but it is very difficult to explain this to ordinary people. It is precisely because of such differences that these two families cannot reach a truce, and a long-term confrontation continues between them. Listening to all this, the girl thought that Simon couldn't accept the fact that he was an Oryx, and that was why he hated himself so much. But if you think about it, silver hair doesn't indicate belonging to that family, and besides, she doesn't even know who her parents are. The girl thought she didn't want anyone to hate her. She knew little about her past. Instead, there was some kind of black hole. She was an orphan, like Saint Cordelia. This young woman's entire life was laid out in the book. It wasn't Oryx blood that turned her hair silver. Everyone was wrong about that. It only happened because the plot called for her to be kidnapped and forced to play the role of a saint. After a while, she calmed down, and when they went to the dining room, she began to enjoy a delicious breakfast. It seems she had never had such a delicious breakfast in her short life. The girl enthusiastically picked up a piece of bread in her hand and screamed loudly that this was real bread, and everything she had eaten before was just blah. The servants present in the dining hall were simply stunned by what was unfolding before their eyes. They couldn't believe their master had brought a girl found on the street back to the castle. The maids couldn't believe they were seeing this with their own eyes. Their usually stern master had completely changed that day and was now sitting in a chair with a child on his lap. When the Duke asked the girl if the food was delicious, she replied that it was simply excellent and smiled. He told her she could simply say, "Yummy." The Duke reflected on how the little girl sitting on his lap had probably learned a lot from the people on the streets and suffered greatly lately. He said that in any case, they simply had to find a tutor for her. When she asked what this word meant, the man explained that it was the name of a person who would explain to her things that she did not know and that she wanted to know. When she said that this required money, and she had none at all, the young man asked again whether she had just told him something about money, and added that it didn't mean anything, and the more money, the better. Husband took a fork from the table into his hand and said that money was not the most important thing in life, and besides, he was not so poor as to take money from children. After that, he handed the fork over to the girl and said that her thoughts were completely occupied with the wrong things. She needed to think about something other than how to make money. Continuing to hold the girl on his lap, the young man said that it was much more important for her now to know how to properly hold a fork and spoon, so that she could eat as much as she wanted. The little girl held the unfamiliar object in her hand, perplexed. She didn't know how to use it, because today was the first time she'd seen a fork. At this moment, the young man's thoughts were occupied with something entirely different. He remembered the story he had told his maid, who had recounted to him her entire conversation with the girl. From that conversation, he had learned much that was unpleasant for him. An elderly woman told him about the little girl's plight. She said the young woman had said she had been starving for weeks. They couldn't feed her due to a lack of money, and so she had a very difficult time. The young Duke seemed to have come to some conclusion. Without rising from his seat, he loudly called his young assistant, who was present, to him. When Simone approached him in response to the master's call, he said that all the caught beetles, as well as even their eggs, should be destroyed. The young man bowed his head in agreement with his master's orders. He said that everything would be done as he had ordered. At this time, the girl, who had been listening to the entire conversation between the two young people, froze with a fork in her mouth and wondered with bewilderment what kind of eggs they could be talking about. Afterward, it was time to discuss the young lady's wishes regarding the furnishings of her bedchamber. Emma suggested she look at the catalog and asked her what kind of room she would like for herself. The girl replied that she really liked the gold. Besides, she thought she could steal it from her room later. Thus began a major renovation of her bedroom. When it was all over, the girl couldn't contain her feelings. Everything looked exactly as she'd hoped, and so she jumped up in delight and landed on her soft bed. Indeed, her room was so beautiful that the girl admired its decoration for so long that she did not even notice how the deep, moonlit night had arrived. Decorated to her liking and redecorated to her specifications, the bedroom was bathed in moonlight, reflecting off the gilded interior. Suddenly, in the middle of the night, the little inhabitant of the palace suddenly jumped up from her place. She woke up, without understanding why, and began looking around. She was troubled by terrible thoughts about the future. They were the reason she had these terrible dreams. Waking up, the girl thought that, fortunately, Saint Cordelia had not yet appeared. But she still couldn't relax, because she would definitely show herself in the end. The girl picked up the vase and thought that, according to the book, it was the saint, not she, who was supposed to meet the Duke of Valencia that day. If only she had known exactly when she was supposed to arrive. But be that as it may, the girl needed money. She remembered the Duke holding her small body close to him. She had asked him then not to scold her for anything. She remembered his answer when the Duke told her that if she didn't understand that something shouldn't be done, then she simply shouldn't do it. But she still needed to get money or something she could sell for it later. That's why she took the vase, thinking it was just a necessity and that she couldn't survive otherwise. The Duke never wanted for anything, and he would never understand it. She peered under the bedspread that covered her bed and, for the umpteenth time, enjoyed the sight of the gold items hidden there. They could be sold later. The girl looked with pleasure at her bedroom, which had been transformed according to her wishes. It was beautiful, but there were still some things left to do, and she still needed to explore the entire palace. She decided that she should start outside, and so, taking advantage of the fact that the moon was brightly illuminating everything around her, she went outside and decided to explore the area around the ducal palace. It wasn't the first time she'd been alone in the city at night. Moreover, the palace was guarded, so the girl felt almost completely protected and feared nothing. She thought it was quite dark here, but still decided that she did not need to attract attention to herself, because if she lit a candle, then someone would certainly pay attention to it and notice her. Suddenly, something strange and familiar caught the little traveler's attention. She suddenly realized she smelled the familiar scent of blood, coming from somewhere nearby. Then, out of the complete darkness, someone emerged, walking barefoot along the stone path. The girl first saw his feet, appearing suddenly before her. After this, her gaze fell upon bare feet, which were splashed with someone's blood. She would have loved to run away at that moment, but she still restrained herself as best she could, and then the owner of the bare feet appeared before her. It was a boy almost the same age as her, but he looked rather strange. His clothes were spattered with blood, and there were drops of blood on his cheek, and the boy's eyes glowed red. The boy, who had suddenly appeared out of nowhere, was pulling a heavy, bloody sword in his hand, which glittered predatorily in the moonlight. The girl noticed warm blood dripping from the tip of the sword, the scent of which caught her attention. She silently watched the boy, who also kept his eyes fixed on her. She really wanted to understand what kind of person this was. At some point, she wanted to run away, and she needed to, but she couldn't take a single step. Corellia suddenly realized she couldn't just up and run. She stood there, unable to move, because it seemed her entire body was frozen in fear. She suddenly felt that she could not move even her little finger, and so she stood like a stone statue, not moving from the spot, while a blood-spattered hand reached out to her. In the next moments, the hand that had been reaching out to her grabbed the girl by the wrist and pulled her toward itself. She couldn't even resist, and so she meekly decided to endure whatever fate had in store for her. The boy held her wrist with his hand, and with his other hand he raised his sword and placed it near the neck of the little stranger. She was terrified. Tears streamed down her face after the cold metal of the sword, reeking of blood, touched her neck. The girl was completely at the mercy of this seemingly small monster. He stared at her with his unusually red eyes, and she couldn't move, only staring at his face with tears in her eyes. His face with its strange red eyes came closer and closer, and when it had already taken over everything, the boy asked if she wanted to check how she would scream when he chopped her into small pieces. There were tears in the girl's eyes. She understood that her fate was being decided at that moment, but, unfortunately, she didn't know what she could do to save herself. The thought that this was no ordinary child kept running through her mind. At some point, it became completely clear to her that this boy she'd met in the middle of the night was completely insane. He looked downright crazy, and even his speech bore little resemblance to that of his peers. Suddenly, something unusual caught her eye, something she saw on the boy's body. It was simply astonishing and unbelievable, and the girl couldn't believe she was seeing it with her own eyes. Cordelia noticed something around the boy's neck. She thought it looked very much like a snake and was a little surprised, as it was unusual for a child. Taking a closer look at what she saw, she suddenly thought it might be his tattoo. But it still looked rather unusual. Then she was suddenly even more surprised, and she thought that if her vision had not deceived her, the tattoo on the boy's neck had begun to move, and the head of the neck had been replaced by her long body. The girl suddenly froze. All thoughts vanished from her mind, and she began to analyze what she had seen. After all, if the snake tattoo was moving across the body, then this person was perhaps the one she had been advised not to see. The girl realized she was in serious trouble. She was already beginning to regret leaving her bedroom so late, but unfortunately, she had no choice but to silently beg this boy to spare her. She felt the cold steel against her skin, right next to her neck. She decided to look into the eyes of the young man holding the sword, to at least bring him to his senses. She felt absolutely terrible, and she also knew that she would not be able to free herself from the boy's grip, and it was very awkward. But it seems that her efforts were not in vain, as if the girl, who had mastered hypnosis, forced the hand of the man standing next to her to unclench the sword and move it slightly to the side. And when the sword was no longer near the girl's head, the fingers holding this terrible bloody weapon unclenched. The next moment, the sword, still dripping with drops of brown blood, fell with a clang onto the stone path where the children were standing. Cordelia couldn't understand what had suddenly happened to the boy. He began to shiver, as if from the cold, then clutched the spot on his chest hidden by his shirt and uttered a single word. Curse. She was stunned by what happened immediately afterward. The girl couldn't hold back a piercing scream when she saw what had happened to the man who had just recently threatened her with a gun. Now the boy lay right at her feet on the stone slab. He tried to curl up into a ball and moaned and sobbed loudly, as if he were pierced by a sharp, unbearable pain. She immediately sat down next to him and tried to think of how she could help this suffering man. Apparently, he had suffered some kind of attack, and most likely it was the curse that had haunted him since birth. The girl asked him if he could tell her what she should do now to help him, or perhaps even call one of the servants. The next moment, she heard someone call her name loudly and turned around to see who was calling her. It was the Duke who came here, and the girl immediately threw herself into his arms, calling him Uncle. When the man asked her if she was hurt, the girl replied that she was fine, and that her neck was also unhurt. Hearing the girl's attention focused on her neck, the Duke became terrified. The young man realized the girl had recently been in mortal danger, and, it seemed, had only miraculously escaped. He immediately closed his eyes and thought that he had been very careless. He should have known that something like this could happen, but he had no time to ponder this for long. It was already late at night, so the Duke asked his pet what she was doing there at such a late hour. Cordelia replied after thinking for a bit, as she had been unable to sleep for a long time, so she decided to take a short walk and then asked the Duke what he was doing there. The man knelt down, extended his hand to the girl, stroked her head, and explained that since she was not in the room, he decided to go look for her. The man's face showed he was deeply distressed by the incident. He asked the girl never to disappear without warning again. She felt a warm hand on the top of her head, and hearing the Duke ask her to be more careful, the girl thought he was genuinely worried about her, and she even found that a little comforting. But then she thought that all his worries had nothing to do with her personality. The Duke was only so worried because he considered her a saint. Having come to this conclusion, she even became upset, realizing that no one needed her in this world, and, most likely, they were trying to use her for their own purposes again. After this, the little inhabitant of the palace pointed with her hand at the boy who was still lying there on the path and asked the Duke what they would do with this guy. The Duke replied that she shouldn't be too concerned, as this wasn't the first time this had happened, and the servants would take care of everything. The girl calmed down a bit, but was still upset by what had happened. When morning came, she completely forgot about her night's adventures and worries. Another day had begun, and with it, new worries. The girl was even more delighted by the new delicacies they had decided to feed her today. She herself couldn't have been happier when she tried the delicious cakes. She savored the flavors of dishes she'd never tasted before. Everything was so incredibly delicious that she couldn't stop eating. Duke von Valencia gazed at his little pet with affection, unable to tear his eyes away. He loved the fact that he could bring joy and pleasure to someone. At one point, the girl looked up from her dish and said that it was simply wonderful and that she felt as if she were eating a cloud. The cake was so soft. The Duke's eyes suddenly changed. Either anxiety or something familiar in the girl's recent words was visible in his eyes. He remembered how, long ago, a woman who also loved cream puffs had said something similar to him. The girl he loved had said they tasted like clouds. The young man suddenly remembered that Rosaline had once told him exactly the same thing about cakes. He told the girl this and added that her blood really did flow through her. The girl stopped eating, thought for a while, and finally came to the conclusion that the woman was not her mother, no matter how much the Duke wanted it. She immediately decided to change the subject of the conversation and asked if everything was all right with the boy she had met at night, to which she heard in response that everything was fine with him, and it would be interesting to know how he managed to get to the main estate from his palace. The Duke immediately promised the girl that he would make sure that nothing like this happened again. She was sure that they had already stained their hands with blood, and after a few moments, she asked the Duke if he had killed anyone, and in response, she heard that only animals on the farm. After this, The young man asked her if she knew who the child was. Cordelia replied that she knew all about it because Emma had warned her about it earlier and told her everything. The elderly woman felt it her duty to tell the young inhabitant of the palace everything. The tattoo on the boy's neck served as proof of his curse. The moment she saw that tattoo, she knew he was Prince Julian II. Besides, that's exactly what the book said. After this, the girl looked again at the man who was listening to her attentively and suggested that he change the subject. The girl reminded the young man of his recent promise. She said he'd find her a tutor. When the Duke explained to her that it takes time to find a good teacher, the girl immediately asked him what he meant by the word good. The Duke replied that it was the top graduate, or someone who had graduated with honors from higher education institutions, someone who could play at least 3 musical instruments and had extensive knowledge of the arts. When the young man added that, of course, a good teacher should be fluent in at least 2 foreign languages, the girl immediately asked him, dumbfounded, whether such a person even existed in this world. The man replied that it could be him, for example, and then the girl wondered why such an outstanding person would teach someone like her. After all, he could teach someone better. Surely that's true. But then she thought again and realized that in such a huge city, people have the right to choose what they do. It's just that she only knows a couple of people: the Duke, his maid, and his assistant. That same evening, lying down in her soft and comfortable bed, the girl thought that it would be very interesting to find out what teachers are like. Even on the way to her bedroom, sitting in the Duke's arms, she asked him if he could do something for her. When the Duke laid her on the bed, she asked him to lower his head. When the man leaned over a little and she could reach him, the girl kissed the Duke on the forehead and said that it was just a drop of magic to make him have good dreams. The Duke was very surprised by this, and he asked the girl who taught her this. In response, Cordelia laughed loudly and said that this is what Emma did when she put her to bed. The Duke said that if Emma had taught him this, then all was well. He leaned toward the girl, kissed her forehead, and wished her good night. The next day at the palace began rather unexpectedly for the girl, as news arrived that Prince Julian wanted to apologize to her. He invited her to his palace. Already on the way to the carriage, the girl thought that she herself would like to tell the prince that she would come. But he was ill, and therefore she decided that she could not do it. She couldn't go to the prince's palace alone. Emma accompanied her, and now it was with this woman that she stood before the door to the boys' chambers. Once again, her senses didn't fail her, especially her sense of smell. She again detected the scent of blood coming from somewhere nearby. Emma knocked on the door, turned to the young gentleman, and informed him that she had brought a lady to him, to which the prince allowed them to enter. The maid opened the door slightly, and they entered the room that belonged to the young master. It was quite bright here. The room didn't look like a boy's quarters, but was quite the fitting of its owner's high status. Looking at this boy, the girl realized that something incredible had happened again, just like that time on the street during her first meeting with the Duke of Valencia. Prince Julian sat on his bed. The girl, unsure how he would react this time, decided to hide behind the young maid. She was terrified that night and thought the boy was truly crazy. Now she decided to take a closer look at him to figure out how to proceed. She looked at the prince more closely and realized that something truly momentous had happened. It seemed as if fate, seemingly impossible, had suddenly resolved itself, and all she had to do was go with the flow. Cordelia timidly peered out from behind the woman and began to study the young heir. She desperately wanted things to end differently than their last meeting. For some reason, she suddenly felt like this boy looked like a real angel. She felt very sorry for him, but she didn't know how she could help him. She began to reflect on how he had seemed to her the last time they met. He seemed out of his mind, and it was no wonder he had seemed completely insane. She still did not dare to look openly at the prince, and again hid behind the maid's wide skirt. After that, she looked out and noticed that the boy, in her opinion, was no different from his peers, and suddenly she thought that, could this really be true? The madman she met yesterday? The prince looked like a very sweet boy, well-groomed, and besides, there was clarity and meaning in his eyes, unlike the previous night. Julian smiled at the girl and the woman accompanying her, and thanked her for agreeing to visit him. When the girl said that he looked absolutely wonderful, the prince decided to get off his bed and said that he had never received such compliments before, and therefore did not know how to respond to them. The girl thought he was speaking in a completely different tone, and when Emma tried to explain to him that he was ill and should not get up, the prince replied that he could handle it himself. After this, The boy approached his little guest and asked her if she really was Rosaria. She didn't know how to deal with him. She remembered their previous encounter, but it seemed the boy's mind held no recollection of the night's events. Seeing that she was completely safe, the girl decided to come out of her hiding place and took a few steps towards the owner of the room. She found it very difficult to speak, so she first cleared her throat, as her throat was completely dry, and then answered that she was Rosaria. The boy thought for a moment, apparently wondering what the name reminded him of, and said he was glad to meet her. He took the girl by the hand and said that his name was Julian von Ortega. The boy knelt before her, took the girl's hand and kissed it, and then said that she could call him simply by his name, Julian. Cordelia was simply horrified by everything that had happened. She couldn't understand what was happening. She couldn't understand what the prince had decided to do. No one had ever done anything like this in front of her before, and so his actions left her completely perplexed. Emma did not pay any attention to what was happening to the girl, and stated that it was time for her to go, and asked to call her if they needed anything. The girl turned back toward the woman, and wondered why she was leaving. She wished she would stay. She immediately turned around and rushed towards the front door, trying to catch up with her maid. The girl realized with regret that she would not be able to catch up with the woman, since the door had closed behind her and she had already left. Prince Julian could not understand what had happened, and looked in bewilderment at his guest, who was ready to burst into tears. After this, the boy asked her for forgiveness and told her that Emma was always very generous to him. He also said he understood how his guest must be feeling right now. After yesterday, she didn't want to be alone with him, and that was perfectly normal. He also said he'd been told the curse could affect others if they were nearby. After these words, the prince turned around and walked towards the door, saying that he would now call the maid. The girl immediately turned sharply in his direction and asked him not to do it. She decided it would be bad if she left the prince alone now. Since she thought that he would not agree so quickly, she grabbed the boy by the hand and said that this was not so, and that he should not call the maid now. She pulled the boy by his cloak and said that she would stay in the room with him and would not be afraid of anything. He moved so fast that she couldn't hold on to him, and eventually one of her shoes skidded forward across the floor. Cordelia suddenly realized that she was losing her balance, and so she screamed loudly as her body swayed backwards. The boy turned back and only gasped, seeing that his little guest was now flying towards the floor, and perhaps would hit it painfully. Feeling that her body was about to fall with all its force onto the wooden floor, the little palace guest closed her eyes and squeezed them shut, already preparing for the fall. But to her great surprise, nothing happened. She felt as if her body was suspended in mid-air, and she opened her eyes slightly to make sure she wasn't imagining it. The prince held her body and head in his hands, and then asked her if she was okay. When she came to her senses a little, she immediately asked the prince who had told him this, and he in turn asked what she was talking about. Cordelia asked the boy how he got this curse, and what kind of brainless idiot dared to spread such rumors. It seemed that one of the words was completely foreign to the boy's vocabulary, because he repeated the word brainless in surprise and questioningly, not understanding what was being discussed. The girl did not explain anything to him, but only smiled slightly and looked into the boy's face, which was very close to her eyes. The prince extended his hand towards the girl, hesitantly checking his movements so as not to frighten her in any way, and hoping that she would not regret her decision. The boy then said that he was asking her for forgiveness, and added that he had no excuses and that he would not be offended if the girl left there. He continued to hold his hand outstretched forward and declared that, although the girl had not yet been officially adopted, it would definitely happen, and then they would become cousins. The girl looked in surprise at the prince, who extended his hand to her. She sat on the floor, surprised by his words that he would do everything to avoid harming her. He also said that she should understand that he didn't want to be hated. Cordelia replied to the prince that she was now completely fine and that he should stop holding her, otherwise he would soon become weak. The boy immediately lowered his hand and looked at his little guest in surprise. He was glad she hadn't run away, as he hadn't had any guests for a long time. After this, the girl added that it was unknown how everything would turn out in the future, since she had not yet been adopted. Prince Julian said that was indeed the case. He had heard that the royal family had rejected the request, but everything should work out, and the girl shouldn't worry. The girl remembered the promise the Duke had made her during their first meeting. He had said he would adopt her, and she, foolishly, had believed his words, thinking everything had finally been sorted out. But unfortunately, it turned out her hopes were in vain. She remained a lonely and unwanted orphan, who, what's more, would soon be expelled from the palace. The fairy tale of her happy future will most likely end soon, and Rosaria von Valencia will never become an inhabitant of the palace, but will go home. She wondered why she was so unhappy. Why, at the very moment when it seemed that luck had smiled on her, everything had changed again. And now it seemed to her that she no longer had anything to count on. The girl suddenly lifted the sleeve of her dress, showing the injection marks on the bend of her elbow, and asked the prince if she was infected. When the boy remained silent and did not answer, she called him to look at his hand and declared that it was perfectly fine, and if anyone told him that the curse could be transmitted, he should cough in his face. The boy looked at her hand searchingly. He understood what the girl was talking about, and his life no longer seemed so puny and ugly. After he thought about the girl's last words about coughing in someone's face, he smiled and said, "Okay, that's exactly what he would do." When the boy asked his little guest if she could promise to visit him more often, she replied that no, because if she made such a promise, she would have to wait for him all day without being able to see her friends. As she was heading for the prince's bedroom door, the girl told him that he should come to her himself, and that she would be very glad to see him. After that, she said goodbye, and that it was time for her to go. But at the last moment, the girl suddenly stopped, as if remembering something. Indeed, how could she not have thought of it? She turned around, walked up to the boy, and stood on tiptoe to reach the prince's forehead and perform an action that had become habitual for her. After this, Cordelia kissed the stunned boy on the forehead and wished him good night. She told the boy that he had done so much for her, and she wanted to thank him, and if he had good dreams, he wouldn't get sick again. Looking at the prince standing in front of her, she thought that no matter what, everything would be fine with him, because very soon a saint would appear who would heal him. She turned once again towards the prince standing in the middle of the room and said goodbye to him, leaving the boy completely bewildered. Prince Julian immediately felt sad after the little girl left his bedroom. He didn't have many friends, and this fleeting visit became a real event for him. One day, Duke von Valencia brought an orphan girl into his home, who immediately became an inhabitant of his house. This girl had a rather unusual appearance. The most important thing was that she had the hair color he hated more than anything in the world. Her hair was silver. The prince thought that the royal family and the church would most likely resort to various tricks, so that, in addition, no one except her personal servants would be allowed to contact her. He remembered the duke's words, spoken to him only recently. He told the boy that he was his nephew, and therefore asked him to treat the girl with care. The boy immediately told him that, according to the duke, she resembled him. He confirmed this, and, besides, he was definitely not a good person. After the duke brought a girl from the streets into his house, rumors began to circulate among the servants. They said the duke had simply adopted the girl, who had silver hair to boot. She was considered a witch, and perhaps the duke had simply fallen under her spell. Rumors spread that the girl knew how to cast spells, and that she had bewitched the duke with her charms, and that he could refuse her nothing. The young prince touched his forehead where the girl had kissed him and thought it was a drop of magic, meant to bring him good dreams. He wondered if it could be considered a spell. After the boy thought about all this, and again remembered the rumors that were circulating about the girl in the palace, he looked out the window and decided that he should probably take a closer look at the new inhabitant of the palace. Cordelia practically ran out of the palace. Her face was red, and one could have assumed she was very upset about something. When Emma asked her if something had happened to her, she immediately and categorically replied that no, and that everything was fine with her. Emma remembered that the girl was considered a swindler, deceiving the duke. The little rascal turned around and, smiling, told the woman that she should hurry up because she wanted some cream puffs. The girl smiled, showing her bared teeth, grimaced, and once again confirmed the gossiping people's guess that she might be an evil witch. But in the end, even if this is not so, then this girl really is just an ignorant child who has settled in the huge, impressively sized, luxurious palace of the duke. One of the following days, the girl, as usual, was sitting on the sofa in one of the rooms of the palace and drinking tea from her mug. In her opinion, trouble always comes unexpectedly. It seemed that was the case this time, when the girl asked the man who entered if they had guests. This was her real misfortune, because guests actually showed up. They were church ministers who had come specifically to see her. The girl looked at the people in white who entered the room with excitement and fear, and realized that this was no accident, and she should not expect anything good from this visit. The men who entered bowed to her, and the one in the middle addressed the girl, calling her Miss Cordelia. The girl merely frowned in response and said loudly that she wasn't Cordelia. She thought it was probably someone from the orphanage where she had lived before. Although the man who came was smiling, the girl noticed that his smile looked insincere when he stated that they were just church ministers. She didn't expect anything good from them, despite their words that they had come here to deliver Miss Cordelia to where she belonged. She understood that she would not be able to defend herself from these men, and therefore, only turning her head, she quietly addressed the Duke, calling him father. At this time, Duke von Valencia continued to sit in his chair, his head bowed and seemingly oblivious to what was happening around him. The man's eyes were closed. It seemed as if this visit was very difficult for him, and he couldn't do anything about it, so he remained silent and indifferent. She was simply amazed by his behavior because he promised to protect her and said that she would stay in this house, and now he did not protest at all at the moment when they decided to take her away from here. Cordelia hung her head and was close to tears. She felt like an abandoned orphan, someone no one could protect, and who would likely have to endure the abuse at the orphanage again. She had been cruelly deceived, and she was disappointed. The girl wondered if this visit from the church officials was for a reason. She mentally turned to her father and asked him if he would really hand her over to them, and wondered why. She understood that her life in this house meant nothing, just as it meant nothing in this world. She was a complete stranger to all these people, and they could unceremoniously decide her fate. The master of the palace sat silently in his chair, his eyes closed. Perhaps he was thinking of something else at the time, but he didn't respond to the girl's calls. But then something seemed to happen. The man suddenly opened his eyes as someone said the word no. Or maybe those were just the words echoing in his head. The little girl turned to him again, reminding him that he had promised not to treat her like that. And why was he now allowing them to take her away? The Duke continued to sit silently, even when the girl said that she could do any work around the house and, in addition, she knew how to wash clothes. Cordelia said she could do the cleaning and wouldn't complain about the side dishes. If he wanted, she was ready to start earning money. Tears of despair streamed down the little girl's face. She didn't know what else to promise, and now she cried loudly and trembled at the thought of what awaited her in the future. She remembered what the book had written. It said that the cause of all her troubles was her tongue. She remembered those words, that everyone would eventually pay for their words and actions, sooner or later. It didn't bother her, but it did bother those around her. These words came from the words of the saint, who also said that she could only say this to the girl, but the rest should not say a word, and asked her if she did not mind. She suddenly remembered that the saint had said that there could always be little secrets between them, and besides, they were friends. Remembering all this, the girl burst into tears and asked if it was because she always said too much. In that case, all she had to do was speak up, and she'd shut up and be as quiet as a mouse. Her crying became louder and louder. Tears streamed down her face, and the girl repeated the word, "Please," over and over again. And at that moment, the man sitting on the chair turned to her and called her by the name of Lady Valencia. He lifted the girl high above him in his arms and asked her to remember his promise. Then he added that they would never fall on their knees. She stared at the young man's face in surprise, unable to believe her ears. For a moment, her eyes went dry, and the girl repeated his last words in her head. Looking at the slightly smiling man, she suddenly realized that at that moment he called her Valencia. The next moment, she grabbed the man by the neck, hugged him tightly, and said that there were still some exceptions. It seemed that everything had been decided in her favor, because the Duke looked menacingly at the guests who had appeared so unexpectedly in his palace, and asked them what they wanted. Sitting in his arms, the young woman watched with interest what the church ministers would say. It seemed to her that her fate depended entirely on it. She remembered how sweetly these people smiled when they said they came to see Cordelia. The Duke looked at them sternly and replied that there was no girl with that name here, and her name was Rosaria. The churchman did not want to back down under any circumstances, and explained that this was an order from the patriarch and the royal family, and he was simply carrying it out. The Duke's eyes gleamed predatorily when the man said that they needed to check whether Cordelia was Rosalind's daughter. Still sitting calmly in his chair, the Duke answered them that they were mistaken, and her name was Rosaria. It seemed the men were prepared for this answer. Without consulting, they continued to insist on their own. The one who was the eldest of them said that the Duke had been looking for Rosalind's daughter for a very long time, and suddenly adopted a child who looked so much like him. The Duke fell silent abruptly, and the priest added that, of course, they had eventually had doubts, and they had now come to him in the courtyard to dispel them. The priest said that, as the Duke probably knows, a holy child at birth receives a special eye color and divine powers. Only a child with such characteristics can become a saint, but his mother does not have the strength to cope with the divine power. Until the child's eyes change to their natural color, they will not be able to open them. Such is the prophecy, and Cordelia seems to fit the description. After this, one of the priests asked the owner of the palace if he knew that they had also been looking for this child, and now they wanted to take her to the patriarch. And even if it turned out that she was not a real saint, he still counted on his understanding, because this also concerned him. The Duke listened silently to the priest's words about how it would be painful for him to realize that he had adopted not a saint, but an ordinary girl. The young man did not answer his uninvited guests, but only thought that this was some kind of absurdity. He was sure that Rosalind's daughter had oryx blood in her. He also knew that if it turned out that she was a saint, the church would try to take her away from him, and they would definitely succeed. Oryx clan, which he hates, will come into play, insisting on blood rights, and will also want to take the girl away from him. The Duke thought that no matter what, the priests and others would continue to pester him. So he decided to end the conversation and said he didn't want to hear any more. The priest grinned slightly and asked the Duke if he was making fun of the girl. He was simply stunned by their questions. Moreover, the priest said that perhaps he was afraid they would figure it out. The Duke turned angrily towards them, his eyes gleaming predatorily again as he uttered a single word, asking them, "What?" The man turned to the priest when they said that he should let Cordelia decide for herself. And besides, she was 8 years old and still a small child. The priest said that no matter how hard the Duke tried to hide all this, the truth still comes out, and everything secret becomes clear. The Duke was surprised by his guest's words that he had the habits of a real tyrant, and therefore it was not surprising that the girl was imprisoned in his palace. Then he added that, of course, Cordelia would not be able to say anything against the Duke, and who knows, perhaps he had threatened her into keeping silent and listening to him. Duke von Valencia decided he couldn't tolerate this any longer. He told the priest they had insulted him and his daughter, and did they really still think they could get away with it? He called upon his knights to remove the priests, and they immediately began to carry it out, holding naked swords to the heads of those who had come. The senior priest addressed his lordship, declaring that their suspicions were well-founded. The man then added that if they harmed the priests, the patriarch and emperor would be furious. A rather noisy scene unfolded in the room, which was witnessed by another unexpected guest. The second Prince Julian appeared at the door. The boy smiled and said that he had heard that some church ministers had come to visit them, and added that it seemed he had been delayed a little. One of the priests turned back abruptly and loudly shouted the word "Prince." He immediately approached the boy who entered, knelt before him, and begged him to listen to him. He then declared that the Duke refused to obey the orders of the patriarch and the emperor. He also threatened the priest with force. The priest added that His Highness must judge who was right and who was wrong here, and asked the prince to make his decision. The young prince looked at the man with confusion, not knowing the essence of his question. When the boy answered that everything was correct, the priest immediately smiled enthusiastically and became happy. At that moment, the prince looked at the little girl who was in his uncle's arms. She, in response, looked at the boy and began to ask him to change his mind and help her stay in this house. The prince told the priest kneeling before him that his words were absolutely true. Hearing this, the priest smiled predatorily, glad that he would still be able to successfully complete his mission. The boy raised his eyes again and looked at the young lady, trying to understand what she was thinking. She looked at him reproachfully, as if condemning him for his hasty decision. The priest was secretly glad that the prince had decided to side with him. Now, the Duke would have had to accept this decision and give them the girl anyway. The man thought that this was just great, and if this sick prince had gone over to their side, then the Duke would no longer be able to do anything. The girl also understood this, and suddenly frowned and began to look with reproach and anger at the prince, who seemed to her to be a very good person and could not have acted in such a way. She was afraid that they could take her away from the Duke now, and so she grabbed the lapel of his waistcoat with her hand. She remembered what she had said about this in the book The Saint, and she understood that, in the end, this was her destiny, just as it had been predetermined, and she must go to church and meet the saint there and die for her sake. Cordelia held tightly to the man who held her in his arms. She really didn't want to go to church, but it seemed she had no other choice. In desperation, she grabbed him by the neck and pressed her head against his, mentally urging him not to give her up to these people. She did not want to go there at all, and she burst into tears again, realizing that now the Duke's desire alone would not be enough to keep her in the palace. When it seemed that everything had already been decided, the prince suddenly spoke again and asked the high priest if he knew what a family was. The girl was surprised to hear that, according to the prince, even animals knew this concept, and the priests dared to break into their house and made the prince's sister cry. When the priest finally decided to negotiate and said that Lady Cordelia had not yet officially become part of the Valencia family, the prince replied that the girl's name was Rosaria. After this, the young prince smiled slightly at the priest standing opposite him and said that he should not change the girl's name at his own discretion, and then added that he did not like it at all. The priest could barely contain himself. His fist began to tremble slightly, and he declared that the girl was just a simple orphan. Hearing this, the prince's eyes flashed. He leaned over the priest and declared that this girl was not an orphan, but Lady Valencia, and she must be treated accordingly. After this, the prince leaned even lower towards the priest, who was frightened by his words, and whispered in his ear that only scum like him could dare to commit such insolence, and that he would have to answer for everything. The prince's tone and harshness did not change after he added that the priest must understand who he was talking to and must not forget the consequences that might await him. Cold sweat poured down the terrified man's face. He wondered if this naive and foolish boy really was a prince who could control the entire kingdom. The young prince continued to stand next to the priest, awaiting his answer. He asked the man if he had understood his words correctly, and whether he understood the full consequences of his actions. The man looked into the boy's face and said he understood everything. It was clear to him that his mission would remain unfulfilled, but right now, the most important thing for him was to at least get out of here with his arms and legs intact. When their conversation was over, the boy straightened up, looked at his future cousin, and smiled at her with his whole appearance, showing that everything would be all right. He was glad that he had been able to serve this sweet young lady, and this made his smile even wider and more welcoming. After this, the boy asked the high priest if he could pass sentence, to which the master of the house replied that, apparently, he could not answer a word, and suggested that Rose say something to him. At first, the girl asked if she really had to do this, and when they confirmed it, she told the priest she didn't want to go to their church and wanted their spirit to never appear on that estate again. The Duke seemed completely satisfied with the turn the matter had taken. He was relieved and pleased that his nephew had managed to protect this little girl, who was to remain in his house. The girl glared angrily at the priest as they left the room. She didn't know what happened to those taken by the riders, but it seemed nothing good awaited them. One way or another, the visit of the uninvited guests ended successfully. The priests left, and peace and tranquility reigned once again in the Duke's palace. But not everything was so smooth. Now the girl sat in the dining room and stared at her breakfast plate, refusing to even touch the food offered to her. She said that she would not eat it because she did not like the prepared dish. The girl explained this by saying that the dish contained bell peppers, and she couldn't stand them. Her adoptive father immediately reminded the young lady that someone had already promised him that he would never grumble about food. The girl put a fork in her mouth, scooping up some food, and thought it was just disgusting. And at that moment, her father praised her for it and said that he had already found a teacher for her. Cordelia literally froze instantly when she heard that she would apparently already have a teacher. A teacher who can play 3 musical instruments, a man who can sing beautifully and, in addition, paints magnificent pictures, real masterpieces. Moreover, this man speaks 2 foreign languages flawlessly. The girl thought that, of course, this must be an exceptional and talented person who would teach her everything that he himself could do. The moment she saw who was to become her teacher, she was literally stunned and could not utter a single word, only silently looking at the young man presented to her as her future teacher. Her teacher was to be a young man she'd met before. Simone asked her what was wrong, and added that he'd never seen her before, but was looking at him as if he knew her. The girl immediately got up from the table, approached the young man, and said that he really graduated from the academy with honors, or was a silver medalist, and he plays 3 musical instruments. The young man standing before her heard the girl tell her that he sang beautifully, drew beautifully, and spoke 2 foreign languages perfectly. Then she asked if that was all about him. Simon slightly closed his eyes and said that he graduated from the academy and was only able to get a silver medal because of his classmate, Mr. Lorenzo. When the girl asked him again who it was, The young man explained that it was Lorenz Ovan Valencia, the Duke's brother. Said he'd never seen him work, but he was always first. After this, he explained that, for him and for other people, this was and remains one of the greatest mysteries of the Academy. When he told the girl that, in answer to her question, he could say that he could do all the things she listed, the girl told Simon that he was so cool. After this, the young man sat comfortably on the sofa and explained to the girl that before they began their training, they still had some things to discuss. Then the young man thought for a moment, as if he were pondering something very important. And while he was busy with his thoughts, another man appeared in the room, and the newly appointed teacher asked him why he was there. And the prince replied that he had come to listen to the young man, and he still had much to learn. After the girl asked the prince if he was ill, and why he had come there, he replied that she herself had said that he could come to her at any time. The young woman said everything was correct and asked the teacher to begin quickly. He asked both children if they knew the origins of the Valencia family, and the young man began to tell his story. The ducal family of Valencia had always been one of the 4 most powerful families in the empire, according to the book About the Day of Judgment, when the history of this world comes to its end. In the book that describes the end of the world, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse will appear, which will personify the 4 forces. Cordelia listened attentively to the fact that in order to protect the world from the horsemen, God sent saints to people. The saints found a man who could help them. This man turned out to be the first emperor. The emperor was unable to fight the 4 knights of the apocalypse alone, and so he gathered 4 heroes who were supposed to help him. But that wasn't all. They were to be joined by saints who would also help defeat the evil horsemen. As a result of all the battles, the first emperor defeated the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse and thus saved the world from destruction. The battles and war with the horsemen continued for quite a long time, and as a result of this war, the land became noticeably empty. The emperor and the heroes who joined him also suffered. They became victims of an irreversible curse. This curse was no simple one. It imbued a person with the power of a knight, and even saints could not lift it. This curse was sealed within the bodies of the heroes themselves. The emperor and his entourage were forced to live with this. The first emperor built an empire with the church at its head, and the heroes of that time were given the title of duke. One of them was Oryx, the white knight who was destined to rule the east of a vast empire. Petros is the red knight, ruler of the west. Lampes is a black knight, ruler of the southern outskirts of the country. Finally, the 4th knight was the Duke of Valencia, who gained the power of the Blue Knight. He began to rule the lands located in the north. Simon told all this and showed with a pointer in his hand the territories that belonged to each of the 4 dukes involved in the victory over the horsemen of the apocalypse. From his story, the girl learned that the first emperor had prevented the destruction of the world by fighting on the inhabitants' arable lands. Thanks to the saints, they too were able to live their lives in peace and tranquility. The prince, sitting next to her, was surprised to learn that the descendants of these heroes, who had fully inherited the strength of the knights and the heirs of the emperor, whose spouses were commoners, were cursed without clarification. The young prince smiled at the girl sitting next to him and said that his mother was also from the Valencia family, so there was a good chance that she was also cursed. Their teacher said that this was not all, and he would like to add to his story. He told both children that through divine power, changes were still possible, and that people believed that the curse could be broken. Simon said that one should hope that in the future, Mr. Julian will be able to escape his curse. The girl was surprised and stunned by her teacher's words that this would happen if she, Lady Rosaria, could help him with this. The young man then added that perhaps she would be the key to solving the curse, and as a result, everyone would be able to get rid of this heavenly punishment. Cordelia couldn't believe what she'd just heard. She didn't believe she was a saint, yet everyone around her seemed to be hoping for it, and she really didn't want to disappoint them. Prince Julian said that Rosaria is merely a member of the Valencia family. There is no evidence that she is a saint. Their young teacher looked closely at the prince and immediately hesitated. After this, he asked His Highness for forgiveness and added that it seemed he had gone too far. At the same time, the girl declared that it was completely unimportant and asked again whether the teacher had said that there was a key. In response to this, the teacher said that, yes, it was different from the one the saint had, with the sealed power that was in this place. And at the moment when the destruction of the world begins, the saint will appear with the key. The girl immediately had a vision from her book. She saw a saint who told her to disappear with the key. It was unknown from where, but she was absolutely certain that the past, present, and future were closely connected, and the key to the Temple of the God's knowledge was also connected to them. At this point, the lessons of both children with their new teacher ended, and from then on, they began to study with him regularly at the ducal palace. It was on one of those days that a boy appeared in the palace, who was now sitting in a chair in one of the rooms and yawning loudly. Julian, who approached him, stared at this guest in surprise, not knowing what to say to him, but eventually, he addressed him by name and asked what he was doing there. It was Black, the heir to the Duke who wielded the power of the Black Rider lamps. As if nothing had happened, the boy was eating cookies, and the prince asked if he had come, as always, to check whether he was dead yet or not. When the prince told him he should know it would take a while, the boy stuffed a cookie in his mouth and said he just wanted to come. Besides, he was irritated by his father always sending him away. The prince sighed heavily, thinking that his father, too, had been completely indifferent to him ever since he had a new wife who had given birth to a new heir. Sitting on his bed, the prince thought that because he did not openly defend the reputation of the Valencia family, many people took him for a stupid, incompetent prince. He said that some even prefer not to believe the rumors and say that because of this girl's appearance, visiting and living on the estate is forbidden. His guest added that, moreover, in order to officially adopt this girl, the Duke personally wrote a letter to the Emperor. Prince Julian explained to the boy who came that all this was being done for the sake of the family, and everything was being done only for the general well-being. Black immediately asked the boy if this girl really was a saint. Sitting in his chair, he became lost in thought, unable to understand how anyone could call a stranger their family. It seemed rather odd, in his opinion. The prince said that it would be for her own safety if she stayed away from him, because if they took her away, they would never be able to see her again. He suddenly clearly saw before him the face of this girl, to whom fate had been so cruel, and who evoked nothing but sympathy in him. The young prince's face looked very thoughtful. He seemed to be pondering something important and hesitant to reach a conclusion. The guest, still present in his room, was greatly disturbed by this. He looked closely at the boy and saw that he seemed to have changed. He then remarked that the prince seemed to have become inspired. The prince didn't immediately answer his question. He turned his head, thinking that this conversation was completely pointless, and asked his uninvited guest if it was time for him to go home. The boy replied that it seemed he hadn't told him everything yet. He remarked that, judging by everything, he would be staying with the prince today, if only because of the way things had worked out. He rose from his seat and began to pace the room, then told them that a wheel had broken on his carriage on the way, and now it was unclear when he would be able to set off again, since, unfortunately, it would take at least a day to repair it. After this, the boy turned his back to the prince, yawned deeply, and informed him that he would now go to the library, as he wanted to read a little in silence. The prince looked at him in bewilderment, still not getting up from his bed. He understood that this was just an excuse to leave his room and do something else. Although it was still daytime, life in the Duke's palace was quiet and calm. Everyone was busy with their own affairs, and no one distracted them from them. The Duke's young daughter was sitting in her room at the time. Since she'd had a tutor, she'd spent a lot of time studying and was now busy making notes in her notebook. The girl stretched her entire body to loosen her muscles. She yawned deeply and told herself that was probably enough, since she'd been reading all day without getting up, and now she couldn't feel her butt. On the table in front of her lay a book and sheets of paper covered with her writing. She thought her teacher was engaging in his lectures, but unfortunately, he assigned a lot of homework. The girl decided it was time to rest after a hard and stressful day. Besides, the prince's friend, whom she had already met, was also here today. Cordelia began to ponder this. Until then, she had been completely convinced that the prince had no friends, and so the appearance of this boy came as a complete surprise to her. The girl looked at her desk, which was littered with papers, and when she turned to the maid with the statement that she wanted to take a short walk around the campus and then return, the maid asked if she really wanted to do it now, and what about the assignments? The girl replied that she just wanted to take a short walk and then come back. When the maid asked again whether she would do it alone and whether something might happen to her if she went alone, the girl immediately asked why she thought that. Emma thought it was wrong to tell the girl why she should remain in her room for now. Her master warned her that she should encourage the girl to remain in her room for as long as possible. The young man had told her at their last meeting that under no circumstances should Rosaria and Black be allowed to meet. Emma understood that she could not possibly fail to carry out the young master's order, but she also understood that it was difficult for the girl to sit in her room for a long time, and therefore, she decided that if she went out for a short while, then nothing should happen. That is why the old woman told the girl that, okay, she could go out for a walk, but she should then come back quickly. Cordelia was very glad that her request had been considered favorably, and so she laughed cheerfully and promised the maid that she would return as soon as possible. The woman handed her a bag of cookies and offered to take them with her on a walk, after which the girl loudly exclaimed that Emma was simply the best and thanked her for the treat. The girl smiled, holding the cookie she had received in her hands, and declared that she loved Emma more than anyone in the world, to which the woman replied that she was simply doing her job conscientiously. Looking out the window at the sky, slightly covered with white clouds, the girl thought that there was nothing better than walking and eating cookies, and she also thought that the woman was simply a genius. The weather was simply beautiful, perfect for a stroll outdoors. Near the palace, functioning fountains emitted cool, moist air. It seems the palace's owners spent a great deal of money on decorating their property. The estate was furnished in the latest fashion and captivated visitors with its opulence. The girl couldn't stop admiring it all and thought that they hadn't skimped on decorating the park near the palace, and everything here was so expensive, ornate, and beautiful. Cordelia suddenly stopped under a tree, hearing some strange noise coming from right above her head. She felt a blow to her head, closed her eyes, and let out a soft cry as something heavy touched the top of her head, and she felt a painful blow. Looking down at her feet, the girl noticed that some book had fallen from the tree right on her head. The book was now lying on the grass right under her feet, and the girl looked at it closely, trying to read its title. Cordelia touched the place on her head where the book had fallen, and thought that something very unusual was happening, because books had already started falling from the sky. The next moment, she bent down and picked up the book. The book seemed completely unfamiliar to her, and she was seeing it for the first time. She still couldn't understand how this book ended up in the park now, and, what's more, fell from a tree right on her head. But it seemed that was not all, because she suddenly noticed with surprise that something else was rustling in the tree, and it seemed that it was not a book. The girl, dumbfounded, looked up to make sure her health was safe this time. But that surprised her even more. In the next moments, the boy who most likely owned the book also fell from the tree. He hit a tree branch hard and was now whimpering, clutching his head. After this, he noticed that he was in a rather unusual position, and slightly waving his hand, looked in amazement at the witness of his fall. He was in no hurry to rise from the girl's body, which now lay directly beneath him. The book had flown from her hands as he fell and lay on the grass next to them. Cordelia immediately asked the boy who he was, and after calling him to stand up because he was heavy, she also began to rise from her seat. At first, she was surprised that someone had fallen on her head right after the book had fallen. But now, looking around, she was ready to burst into tears, seeing that she wasn't the only one who had suffered. The girl looked questioningly to the side and was upset to see what had happened, other than the sudden appearance of this naughty boy. Next to her lay the bag that the caring Emma had given her. The fall had caused it to come undone, and its damaged contents had spilled out. The cookies looked simply horrific. Cordelia didn't know how to react to this. She was ready to burst into tears, and only the presence of a stranger kept her from doing so. The girl immediately jumped up from her seat and was simply disappointed because she hadn't even eaten a single piece yet, and now it seemed impossible to her. A puzzled boy stood behind her. He watched her, unsure what to do, and was surprised by the girl's sudden jump and dash. He looked at this stranger in surprise and asked what had happened to her, and then added that there was no need to worry because it was just a cookie. His words upset the girl even more. She was simply furious and said that these weren't just cookies because Emma had given them to her. The boy said there was no need to cry. He promised to buy her another 100 of those same cookies, and there was no need to worry about it at all. Cordelia told him that she had not intended to cry at all, and then asked the boy if he was the friend who had come to visit Prince Julian. The boy chuckled incomprehensibly, and then said that this was indeed the case, if they could be called friends. Then the little girl said that Julian was in his room, so why was this boy here at that time? He replied that he'd just decided to read a little and climbed a tree with his book. She read the title of the book and told the boy that he seemed to be reading rather boring things, and then asked him what the study and construction of balloons meant. When he asked the girl if she could count it, she immediately answered him that, of course she could. To make sure that the girl could read, the boy grabbed his hand and opened the book to a random page and said that if this was the case, then she should read this word. After the girl did this without difficulty, the boy was very surprised that she could read it all, and asked how she knew this and whether she had studied ancient languages before. Cordelia couldn't understand what was so surprising about this, and simply asked the boy what had surprised him so much. When he said that she had just read a difficult text and where she had learned it, the girl replied that she had never learned anything like that, and it had happened naturally. The boy seemed unable to comprehend how this could be. He had never encountered anything like this before and thought it simply impossible. And besides, he didn't think she could have done it. Cordelia was also perplexed. She couldn't understand what was so unusual about it, and was therefore amazed at how the boy was simply stunned by what she had read. He was simply indescribably amazed by what the girl had done. He asked her again if she had simply gone and read it. At this point, they were distracted. Somewhere in the distance, a woman's cry was heard, calling for her lady and asking where she was. The girl immediately responded to her maid's call. After this, the girl turned her head towards the stranger and said that it was time for her to go, as she had been called. She then added that she had stopped arguing with the prince and should just play with him. She added that Julian was ill and spent his days sitting in his room, very bored. The boy was again surprised by what he had just heard. Could the prince really be bored? And could he and the girl really be talking about the same person? But he still managed to ask this girl if she really was the one called Rosaria, to which he heard an affirmative answer and a question about what was wrong with that. He realized he'd just met the person everyone was talking about lately. She'd become the center of everyone's attention. And he'd also realized she wasn't exactly an ordinary child. The boy looked again at the girl walking away and thought that he had just met Rosaria herself. Von Valencia. He knew that the Duke of Valencia was carefully hiding this child from others, a child who could very well turn out to be a saint. He kept his eyes on her and thought that it wouldn't hurt to get to know her even better and learn more about who she was. The boy decided he needed to do something. With that in mind, he hurried to catch up with the young woman. As he approached the girl, he immediately stopped and looked intently into her eyes. He then reached forward with his hand to take the little girl's fingers and told her that he liked her. He pressed her hand to his cheek and told Cordelia that he liked her very much and would like to get to know her better. Black told her that he couldn't stand stupid children and crybabies, and added to the girl that she was not like that at all, and not a crybaby. He looked into the girl's eyes, which were fixed on him, and added that she was not stupid at all, and was different from the girls he had met before. After this impudent boy even dared to kiss her hand. The girl thought it was all too sudden. She rushed to disappoint this impudent fellow, saying that she didn't like him at all and had no desire to see him again. Cordelia told him to stop talking nonsense and demanded that the boy immediately let go of her hand. He seemed very shocked by all this. He couldn't believe what had happened and quickly asked his interlocutor if she hated him. He may not have expected such an answer, but he heard a resounding yes. The girl confirmed that she truly hated him. This was completely incomprehensible to him. They had only just met, and there was no reason for such emotion to be expressed. So the boy asked her, why? Cordelia replied that there was no reason for this. She said she simply hated him and didn't want to explain anything. At this time, the girl's elderly maid continued to search for her. She walked around the park, calling for her lady to respond and asking if she was there. The girl decided that there was no point in making the woman worry and loudly shouted to Imma that she was there. When the girl asked the stranger, stating that she had to go already, what his name was, the boy replied that his name was Black. She felt like she already knew the name. She couldn't quite place it, so she paused for a moment. After this, the young lady turned her head towards the boy and said to him questioningly, "Excuse me." The boy immediately put his hand to his chest and said that his name was Black von Lampus, and he belongs to one of the 4 noble ducal families. The girl thought again, thinking that this name was already familiar to her, and it seemed that these memories upset her a little. She remembered that when they were with the saint during the fire, she called her to look and pointed to the people who came to save them. She remembered that these people had indeed come to save her, but their target was not them at all, but only one of them. And the girl remained sitting in the middle of the fire, while the saint was carried out from there. The girl clearly saw in front of her how the people who came with the saint carried her away, and she remained defenseless among the hot flames. And indeed, one of those people was the man called Lampez. She saw him from behind, walking away with the saint. The girl suddenly thought in horror that among the 3 who were involved in rescuing the saint, There really was Prince Lampus. The boy immediately asked her if she knew him, and thought at that moment that she must definitely know. Cordelia was simply horrified by this question, and categorically stated that she did not know this boy, and added that he was definitely not familiar to her. As they heard the old maid's voice asking where the lady had disappeared to, the boy put his finger to his lips and asked his interlocutor to keep their meeting a secret. The girl immediately asked him why this should be so, and asked why she needed to hide anything from others. Black thought about how such situations annoyed him, but he wanted no one to know about his meeting with this girl. When the voice of an old maid was heard somewhere nearby, looking for her little mistress, the girl immediately screamed her name loudly. But the next moment, the boy's hand covered her mouth, and he pulled her body somewhere to the side. EMMA passed very close to them, looking for the young lady, and at that time they were hiding behind the bushes, and the boy continued to squeeze the mouth of his companion. She was having trouble breathing, only able to do so slightly through her nose. She wondered if this boy really thought he could fool her, and she decided she should bite his finger. But this was unnecessary, as the young duke immediately loosened his grip and asked the girl to remain silent. He promised to give her his cookies, and she could choose whichever she liked. Then, she immediately replied to him that he would give her the cookies in any case, because, besides, he promised her 100 cookies. Afterwards, the boy told her she could ask him for anything. She just had to pretend they'd never met. When she asked if he really wanted anything, he replied that he did. The little rogue thought for a moment, chuckled, and looked closely at her companion's face. She seemed to have come to some conclusion, as a result of which a sly smile appeared on her face and lips. After this, the girl approached Black at a very close distance, put her hand on his shoulder, and began to look intently into his eyes. At that moment, Emma heard the little lady's voice calling her name. The woman immediately turned around at her call. When the maid saw the girl running, she asked her where she had been. She replied that she had just been wandering around the yard, and that was why she hadn't heard her voice. When the woman reported that she had imagined it, or that she had actually seen a boy about the same age as her mistress, the girl laughed loudly and asked if it was really a boy, and added that she had not seen anyone, and again asked what had happened. Emma immediately explained to her that today, Prince Julian had a guest, but he had disappeared somewhere, and because of this, everyone was worried. And now the girl needed to return home quickly. Otherwise, the teacher would find out that she had not done her homework. The girl didn't understand why the maid was in such a hurry, but she thought that she would probably find out later, and now she said that she was ready to go to her room. She moved toward the entrance and into the palace, a satisfied smile on her face, thinking that none of this mattered at all. Her hand slid towards the pocket of her dress, into which the girl had placed something. Cordelia thought she wouldn't want to ask for anything too big, lest she attract attention. But what she took from this boy was, in her opinion, a truly excellent decision. She remembered what the boy's face looked like at the moment when he promised her anything, and she asked him for the brooch that was on his chest. At that moment, the boy's expression changed subtly, and now she thought that this thing was most likely very valuable, and she hoped that she could sell it and get a lot of money for it, and then escape from this palace. The girl continued on her way, already making plans for the future. In her opinion, this was a rather lucrative deal in exchange for her silence about meeting the boy. But suddenly, the girl remembered something else she hadn't taken into account. She remembered that her broken cookie was still there, and he had promised to give her lots of cookies in return. She felt very awkward in front of the elderly woman, who probably really wanted to please her, and for this purpose prepared a delicious treat for her for the road. The girl was very upset as she followed her maid. She didn't want to upset the woman, and she was very upset that everything had happened this way. When she called Emma by name, she immediately turned to her and looked questioningly at her young mistress. She didn't want to talk about her meeting with the boy at all, and so she said, stumbling and stuttering, that the whole thing was that when she was walking in the park, she accidentally fell, and the cookies, unfortunately, got spoiled. When she told him that the tasty treat had broken, Emma didn't pay any attention to it, but was only alarmed when she heard that the girl had fallen. She approached Cordelia and began asking her with concern how this had happened, and if the young woman was okay. She began examining her and asked if she was hurt. The girl didn't understand the reason for the uneasiness. She didn't care about any of this, but she asked the maid if she was angry about what she considered to be this offense. Emma immediately crouched down in front of the girl and looked her in the face. She asked her what had happened and wondered why she should be angry with her. The woman was very touched by the young lady's answer that she had made the best cookies in the world for her, but she had broken it. The woman, an elderly servant, only smiled slightly and replied that nothing terrible had happened and that there would still be plenty of the same delicious and aromatic cookies to bake, so the girl should not worry or be upset at all. She remained seated before her mistress, took her hands, and told the lady that she would never be angry with her for something like that, especially since it wasn't her fault at all. And even if she were a little guilty, she still wouldn't be angry. The girl laughed and shouted loudly, "Hooray!" after her maid told her that she had suffered anyway because she had not been able to taste the cookies, and therefore she was ready to make her more. When they entered the palace, the girl was delighted that her little adventure had ended so wonderfully. She loudly exclaimed as she entered the building that Emma was the best. The Duke was sitting in his chair when he was informed that Prince Lampez had been to Nora's bakery. He had ordered a huge quantity of cookies and sent them to Lady Rosaria. The young man immediately inquired about the matter. The little girl sitting next to him was also curious. She wanted to know exactly how big was huge. Confused about what was happening around him, the young man glanced sideways at the girl. He would very much like to know the reasons behind the boy's actions. Cordelia wasn't bothered at all. She was pleased that the boy had kept his word and sent her the cookies he'd promised. The Duke immediately turned to his charge and said he was very curious to know if the girl had met him before. She, perplexed, asked him again if they had met, then recalled that the boy had demanded her to remain silent about their meeting. After this, the girl laughed and told the young man that, be that as it may, it was her gift, and therefore could she eat these cookies? The Duke told her that she could do with her gift whatever she pleased, and then thought that, despite all his precautions, the two seemed to have met after all. When the girl said that perhaps they should invite Prince Julian here to see them, the young man said that perhaps that would be unnecessary, and it would be better to leave him alone for now. His little companion immediately became alarmed for some reason. She looked at the Duke in bewilderment and asked him why they should do such a thing. She couldn't understand why the boy couldn't be invited to breakfast. The Duke replied that the prince loved solitude, and besides, it was better for him not to meet people because of his curse. Cordelia, of course, understood that no one would allow the prince to join them, but she still hoped to spend as much time with him as possible. She really wanted this, and so she shouted out loud that all this was superstition, and that there was no curse on the prince. Then she asked the Duke how he could say something like that. The young man, just like the girl a few moments earlier, was perplexed. He couldn't understand why she had suddenly become so alarmed and began to prove events so obvious to everyone. Cordelia was eager to explain everything to this man. She began her story by reminding him that they were family, and then added that he was a real idiot. The Duke immediately began to correct himself. He said that he seemed to have misspoke slightly, and that this was not at all what he had meant when he said that the prince would not be able to join them. Then the young man thought for a moment and told the girl that, despite all her persuasions and arguments, it was still not worth inviting the prince here, and he would be much better off in his own chambers. The girl was upset and even stunned by the words that she should, if possible, stay as far away from the boy as possible. She didn't want that at all. It was precisely because of her reluctance to carry out what she considered to be such a reckless order that she wondered why she should not meet with this poor boy. The Duke immediately began explaining everything to her. He said that nothing terrible had happened only because the prince lived alone. He also added that he had seen a boy wandering around the estate at night, and that this did not bode well. Cordelia was simply devastated by his words. She didn't want to believe it. After all, she had met the boy and noticed that he couldn't be a threat, even with his supposedly fake curse. She felt sad, sitting on the edge of her chair and thinking that all this was not true. And the Duke continued and told her that he could control the curse, and yet it was very unreliable, and it was unknown how and how it could all end. The young man said that he thought he was very lucky to have survived the previous night, but who knew what might happen next time, when no one was around and the curse still prevailed over the boy's soul and body. She nervously clenched her hands into fists and began to think about what she should do after the Duke told her that her safety, as well as the safety of the little prince, was very important to him, and therefore all precautions should be taken. Hearing that her opinion was not going to be listened to, and that now her communication with the prince would be very difficult, the girl in despair got up from her chair and moved towards the exit of the dining room. Without even turning her head towards the young man, she walked past him and, already at the door, said that she didn't want any cookies. After this, she left the room, slammed the door behind her, and left the young man completely bewildered and upset. Once he was alone in the room, he began to wonder if he had done the right thing. The Duke believed that if he limited the interaction between his little charge and his nephew, nothing bad would happen if they saw each other as little as possible. He turned his worried and puzzled face to the maid when she asked the Duke if she could tell him something. Emma said it concerned the lady and Prince Julian. She believed they got along very well, and he was her best friend who would never harm her. After this, the elderly woman smiled slightly and added that, in her opinion, it might be that the girl simply needed friends her age and was a little bored in this deserted house. The young man thought for a moment, then said that not much time had passed since the high priest's visit, and wondered if it was still too early for the girl to go somewhere outside the palace, even to communicate with her peers. She looked imploringly into the young man's face and asked him to consider her words. She also asked him to remember that he couldn't hide the girl for the rest of his life. The woman said that 8-year-olds should be learning and experiencing everything possible. After all, this is the age when they should be meeting new people and gaining experience. Not sitting cooped up alone, not meeting anyone. She continued to talk to the young man for a long time, assuring him that he could make a mistake, and said that he should not overdo it in trying to protect her, because in the end, she would still have to end up in the outside world someday. After some time, the woman was busy combing her pet's beautiful silver hair. The girl answered affirmatively to her question about whether she liked the procedure, and added that it seemed like she never stopped smiling for a second. The girl replied that she was very excited about today's event, because if she went there, she could make many friends her age. Today was her first day out, and it was an exhibition organized by the family of Count Fordner. When all the preparations were completed, and the girl was already in elegant clothes, washed and combed, she turned to the maid once again and said that they were already setting off on their journey with the teacher. Her sweet maid stood on the threshold of the house, along with several of her subordinates, and waved her hand to the girl once more in farewell. The girl and her young tutor climbed into the Duke's carriage, and it immediately set off for the upcoming ride. The girl was eager to be among other people as soon as possible. After some time, their journey was over, and the girl got out of the carriage, but she felt as if something was wrong. Her legs seemed to be swaying and giving way. Her tutor went with her because the Duke was busy with work at the time. When their journey was complete, the girl told her tutor that she felt a little unwell, even though she had taken her pills. The young man replied that perhaps this first time was due to the portal travel. Her body wasn't yet accustomed to this, and so she might feel a little out of sorts. The girl told her mentor that she needed a little time to get back to normal and promised that she would catch up with him a little later. Cordelia thought it would be better this way. She didn't know whether she would vomit or not, so she really didn't want anyone nearby to see it, to which the teacher replied that he understood and would be waiting for her inside. The building they arrived at was very crowded. An art exhibition was taking place there, and many people were very interested in it. After a while, Cordelia also entered the building and sighed with relief. She seemed to be feeling much better and ready for a new adventure. She didn't have any acquaintances here yet, and so she simply wandered around the exhibition, not noticing the puzzled looks that others present in this place gave her. One of the girls kept her eyes on the Duke's pet, thinking that she was seeing this girl for the first time and was interested in what kind of family she might be from. It was with the aim of finding out all this that she followed this unfamiliar girl with silver hair and called out to her, wanting to talk to her a little. When Cordelia stopped and turned to the girl who had called her, the girl immediately asked her who her parents were. She turned around and looked at the girl in bewilderment, and then told her that she had no parents. The stranger wouldn't let up. She'd set out to find out who this girl was, and now she asked who her relatives were. Cordelia replied that how could there be relatives if there were no parents, and then turned around to go look for her teacher, frightened by the girl who was so aggressive towards her. And while the stranger went off somewhere, the girl stood there and wondered what was going on. She wondered if this stranger had really come from some foreign land. Cordelia began to look around the rooms where the vernissage was currently taking place, but to her regret, the teacher was nowhere to be seen. Here and there were people hanging around who had come to look at the exhibition of paintings, and they were busy either looking at them or making small talk. Cordelia couldn't find a teacher, so she decided to explore the art on her own. She walked along the wall and began examining the paintings. In front of one of the paintings on display, the girl stopped in bewilderment and began to look at it in bewilderment. In her opinion, this painting absolutely didn't deserve to be in this place. It depicted something incomprehensible, and so she wondered if this could really be art. She looked at the painting hanging before her, wondering what it was. Most likely, in her opinion, it looked more like a few carelessly drawn lines. When a boy passed by, Cordelia said out loud that it was not a painting at all, and that any person could have drawn something like it. Unfortunately for her, the girl's words reached the ears of this little boy, who was walking behind her at that time, and he immediately stopped when he heard what this young lady said. All the man's emotions were on his face. The boy turned to her angrily and asked what she had just said. Cordelia looked at him at first, puzzled, and then explained that she thought anyone could draw something like that, and that she could do something similar as well. The boy literally became furious when he heard this and told her that this was a real avant-garde painting, and it was very expensive, worth 5,000 gold coins. The girl wasn't the least bit shocked. She continued to look calmly at the boy who had said that no one could replicate her, and certainly not any girl. He immediately launched into an explanation, explaining that, moreover, the artist had worked on this painting until his last breath and died of exhaustion. This is what made his painting famous. There's no hidden meaning, so its value has only continued to rise over the years. This only further provoked the boy's companion. She said that the artist had starved to death because he had no money, so why sell his painting at such a high price now? The boy merely smiled at such an amateurish opinion. He asked the girl if she didn't know that his family had supported the artist before his death, allowing him to earn a living. Cordelia immediately asked why the artist was starving in that case if he was receiving support from the boy's family. He began to explain to her that the artist's paintings hadn't sold well, which was obviously why funding had been cut. But thanks to his family's efforts, the artist had become famous, and he was certain he was happy now, despite his death. The girl disagreed with this completely. She asked how they knew the artist was happy, and whether it wouldn't be irresponsible for them to starve him and let him die. Her interlocutor literally flew into a rage and started yelling loudly. He asked the girl what she had just said. At that moment, the girl with whom Cordelia had spoken earlier ran up to him and began to whisper something quietly in his ear. Hearing this, the boy's expression changed even more. He angrily said, "That's how it is," and loudly asked how she got in. Several other onlookers, drawn by the noise, were watching everything that was happening at the vernissage. Among them were a couple of smartly dressed girls. The boy still wouldn't let up. He walked up to the girl, poked her in the forehead with his index finger, and said that's why people like her were such cowards. He kept pointing his finger and urging her to look at herself, saying that she had such an outfit and was trying so hard to become an aristocrat. This even frightened the little girl. She, puzzled, placed her hand on the spot on her head where the boy's finger had touched her. She would have really wanted to run away or disappear into thin air the moment this boy declared that she was worse than all of them in every way and from the day she was born. Hearing this, Cordelia decided that she had nothing more to do here, and, turning around, began to walk away, trying to get rid of the annoying boy and the equally snide observers. He didn't pay any attention to it, and said that if all this had happened during his parents' time, the girl would have been thrown out of here at the entrance, and she would never have ended up in such a place. The boy decided to continue his angry and long tirade, and began to say that in their times, unfortunately, there was no order, and therefore he would not be able to punish her in such a way. The next moment, there was a noise behind him, and then something like the whistle of an object cutting through the air. It was this very object that was now inexorably approaching the head of the boy, who had decided to finish off the guest who had appeared out of nowhere at the vernissage. The girl held the painting in her hands and was ready to repeat the action she had performed again. She even thought it was quite funny. The boy she'd hit on the head with the painting found himself sitting on the floor, clutching the spot on his head where the ill-fated painting had landed. Now he himself felt the weight of the artist's incredible talent. His eyes were filled with bewilderment at what had happened, which could easily have turned to anger. He couldn't believe that someone had violated his privacy in his home. After this, he became angry and began to shout angrily, pointing his finger at the girl and could not calm down. Cordelia was ready to use the painting again. She held it high above her head, intending to immediately respond to an attack if one were to occur. The girls, who had been watching everything unfold before their eyes, immediately began screaming loudly. They called for help, saying it was a very expensive painting, and hoping it was all just some terrible dream. The boy screamed exactly the same. He decided to ask the girl who had hit him if she even knew who he was, and how she had dared to do something like that. Cordelia immediately asked him who he was, and then added that he was really her father. When the girl said that she didn't even know or imagine who he was, The boy shouted that this was very low and asked her how she dared to hit him. There was genuine anger in his eyes and face. It seemed he was ready to beat up the girl who dared to hit him in his own home. And besides, this girl just told him that she considered him pathetic, but she came anyway, so he should still be grateful. In the next moments, the boy became even more angry and swung his fist, saying that she really thought that only she knew how to fight. But someone's hand suddenly appeared out of nowhere, right in front of the astonished girl's face. After that, she saw how some boy in a red cloak and with red hair stood between her and this boy, and asked him if he really wanted to become a laughingstock again. The girl could now only observe the scene unfolding before her eyes from behind this suddenly appearing guest. Her savior arrived just in time. Despite the awkwardness of the situation, the boy continued to smile. He told the man standing before him to stop before he did something stupid again. The girl peeked out from behind the man's hand and watched with interest how events would unfold. When everything calmed down a little, the boy who had suddenly appeared was able to lower his hands, and the girl was already standing completely freely next to him, holding the same avant-garde painting in her hands. The face of the little master of the house looked very angry. He couldn't understand what this man was doing here, and that made him feel even worse. And the boy standing opposite him seemed not to notice the anger in his eyes and smiled peacefully, still looking into his face. Cordelia looked at the man who had so suddenly decided to stand up for her and thought she had never seen this guy before. She also thought that maybe he knew this madman. At this point, the boy who had started this whole unpleasant situation was breaking out in a cold sweat. He understood that the Duke's family possessed a pride comparable to that of the royal family. And while he was thinking about how it was possible not to know someone here, the girl decided to turn to her protector and asked him what the hell he was getting in the way of, and said that he should get lost. Her words seemed to have a profound effect on the boy because his expression immediately changed. He stopped smiling and looked at the girl with bewilderment, but it didn't last long. The boy spun around in his seat, cheerful and happy, and asked again if she really thought it looked like fun. Cordelia replied that it certainly wasn't that boy, and wondered, who could it be? Who could be that guy's friend? And why was he acting like that? He couldn't understand how someone couldn't recognize him when they met, and said that it looked very interesting, and then added that his hobby was finding and appreciating works of art. His interlocutor replied that she had absolutely no need to know this, and therefore suggested that the impudent boy go somewhere else and chat there about whatever he wanted. Hearing this, he just laughed out loud and said that now he would definitely not go anywhere, because she was really very interesting, and he would like to continue their acquaintance. The little owner of the vernissage stood right next to him while this guy told the girl that this guy's family, it seemed, had deliberately starved the artist to death. The boy immediately grabbed another of the paintings hanging on the wall and began waving it. His face at this moment looked truly mischievous, and then he said something about his weapon and asked the owner of the house when they should schedule their duel. The boy seemed to be full of boundless energy. He kept jumping up and down and talking loudly, and then he told the girl that she was absolutely right. In his hand he held a painting, which suddenly, for some reason, became engulfed in a bright flame, and sparks began to fly from it. And then the boy said that this thing that he was holding in his hands cost someone their life. The children who were watching the whole thing immediately noticed that the painting had started to burn, and decided that maybe they should call the adults after all. But the red-haired man seemed completely oblivious. He turned to his new acquaintance and told her that searching for and appreciating art was a very important activity, and that he had been doing it for a long time. After this, he approached the puzzled girl and asked her if she knew the cost of the two paintings that they were now holding in their hands. The boy began to examine the paintings that hung on the walls of this room, and, to the great surprise of everyone present, other paintings also burst into bright flames. Cordelia couldn't believe this was actually happening, and that it wasn't some kind of illusion. The paintings on the walls of the vernissage burst into flames one after another, sparks of flame swirling around them. Her thoughts were far from dwelling somewhere safe and secluded. She was only thinking about this boy's red hair, and now she had seen with her own eyes how real fire magic works. This boy still did not calm down. He seemed to enjoy his strength and, stretching out his hand to the girl, said that, in his opinion, this was such a terrible beauty, and asked if she liked all this. Everything around them was ablaze. The fire seemed to have spread not only to the paintings, but to everything else inside the house. But the girl wasn't at all frightened. She was busy watching the expression in the eyes of this young man, who now seemed to be having fun using his power, and did not feel any remorse about what happened. The girl took a closer look at his appearance, noting his red hair and green eyes, and suddenly realized that this boy was the heir to the Red Knight's power. He was Edmund von Petros, the boy, who had previously seemed to feel in control and was ready to throw his guest out of the house, now remained completely silent. He stared at the painting that had burst into flames on the wall, his eyes fixed on it. Tears streamed down the boy's face, and he only whispered softly that it was a picture of his family. He couldn't understand why this had suddenly happened, and feared the consequences that awaited him. But the perpetrator of this sacrilegious act wasn't at all upset. He put his arm around the boy's shoulder and urged him not to worry, then added that he would pay what the paintings were worth now. The boy said that if his mother and father found out about this, he would definitely be in trouble. He then added to the Duke that if he stayed, he would have to pay more. The boy was very surprised by the words of the red-haired Duke when he said that the compensation would definitely satisfy his family, and they would be able to fully restore their lost name. The young Duke looked into the boy's face and asked him if he still wanted more. He suddenly realized that there might be some catch in this question, and therefore answered negatively that no, and he did not want to claim anything more. Two boys were walking along, chatting pleasantly with each other, and the one who caused the fire said that, judging by the girl's words, the artist died of hunger, so there was no reason to charge a lot of money for this painting, and asked if this was true. The painting they were discussing was already burning on the floor. The young man remarked that, besides, the owner of the vernissage believed the artist had become famous only thanks to his family. He continued to chat pleasantly and said that, according to the boy, if people die, they are still happy, and then suddenly asked him if he wanted to check it out himself. The boy suddenly realized what his words meant. His body began to tremble, and cold sweat began to run down his face. It was all a veiled threat, and now the one who made it was watching carefully how it affected his interlocutor. But after that, he seemed to change again in his face and mood, patted the boy on the shoulder in a friendly way, and repeated several times that it was just a joke. The boy walking next to him didn't notice that the boy's gaze was anything but playful. He was inquisitively studying everything going on around him, and not a single small detail escaped his attention. And at one of these moments, he suddenly saw that the girl with whom he had been talking so sweetly a few minutes ago was sitting to the side and seemed to be very upset by what had happened here. Cordelia couldn't believe she'd found herself, wittingly or unwittingly, at the center of a real scandal. Now everyone could find out that the fire had started precisely while she was speaking with the owner of the house. So now she felt absolutely terrible and trembled with fear. The young Duke noticed that something was wrong with her and immediately jumped up to her, asking how she was feeling and if she needed help. But Cordelia remained silent. She thought that as a result of everything that had happened, she would find herself thrown out on the street again, and she would most of all not want today's events to lead to that. As if through the darkness that clouded her eyes, the girl saw a picture burning on the wall in front of her, and a boy standing in front of her asking her if she was okay. She was definitely not okay. She suddenly remembered a completely different fire, and the feeling was simply terrifying. She couldn't move or utter a word in response. There was a fire reflected in her eyes, and it was as if this vision had completely paralyzed the little girl, and therefore she could not move even a finger. The boy loudly called for her to wake up, and then somewhere in the distance, another person joined him. Her teacher seemed to have finally been found. He ran towards her, shouting loudly to ask if his young lady was all right. Cordelia felt absolutely terrible. It seemed as if the flames were not only all around her, but also raging inside her body. She was incredibly hot, and it seemed as if she couldn't breathe. The girl was in great pain and hurt. She didn't want to die, and so she wanted to scream as loudly as she could for someone to help her. At that moment, a girl's face appeared right next to her, a face that seemed familiar. It was the saint, who told her that she had no reason to worry at all. The saint said that they must be saved, but the girl knew that it was impossible, and no one would do anything to save her. And so a tear of sorrow and disappointment ran down her face. While the people who came to save them chose only the saint, and the girl was left in the middle of the flames, she looked after them with disappointment and resentment in her eyes, just as unable to make any move. The saint seemed to want to save her, and so she smiled at her, looking into her eyes, and repeated her words about not worrying, and that they would definitely be saved. To convince the girl that this was not a lie, The saint came even closer to her, took her hand, and, looking into her eyes, said that everything would definitely end well, and they would be saved. Cordelia realized that it was a saint, but she did not understand how she had met her, and so the girl decided that it was just a dream. Well, if it was a dream, then it was unclear why she was surrounded by flames. If it was a dream, it was unclear why she was in so much pain and, on top of that, why it was so hot. Cordelia continued to cry and heard some calls to her, wondering who was there, and was perplexed as to whether someone had really come for her. Then, she suddenly saw a young man emerge from the flames, and his face seemed very familiar. She had met him once before, and it was none other than Black. The girl joyfully shouted out the name of this boy, and was excitedly happy, thinking that he had really come here to save her from this burning hell. But she was in for a real disappointment, as the boy walked past her without paying any attention to the poor girl. She peered intently into the fiery element raging around her, trying to guess what would happen next, and hoping that a happy deliverance awaited her. Following the figure of the boy who passed by her, someone else appeared, and the girl, studying, began to look at the next young man, hoping that he would be the one to become her savior. This young man ran past him just as quickly, and his figure and face also seemed very familiar to the girl. She realized that she had met this young man too, and it was none other than Edmund, who had also run past her and taken no action to help her. Cordelia watched with disappointment in her eyes as these young men walked past her towards the saint, not paying any attention to her and not wanting to save her from the flames. When they began to move further and further away, she finally decided to ask them for help and waved her hand at them with hope, calling for mercy. The flames around her grew hotter and hotter. They drew closer, and the girl cried out for help, but no one rushed to save her. The young men who were now passing by her remained indifferent to her requests and appeals, picked up the saint in their arms and walked away with her, not at all interested in the fate of another girl. Being ignored made the girl feel even worse. She was in excruciating pain. It felt like she couldn't move, and she kept repeating that she was human too, and she too knew pain. The fiery flames were very close to her. It seemed as if the girl's entire body was now engulfed in flames, and a fiery conflagration had also flared up within her, engulfing her body and mind. She covered her eyes with her palms in helplessness and realized that this was the true end. No one could save her, and now she would die. The girl cried out loudly, just one word. Yes! And this scream was very long and terrible. She felt something change within her. Suddenly, something touched her face, and it was quite unpleasant, but still not as painful as she expected. The fire was blazing around her. She could feel its heat, and through it, she could hear calls for the girl to wake up and explanations that it was just a dream, and she just needed to wake up. Cordelia removed her palms from her face, looked at them, and suddenly realized that this was just a story from a book. It was the content of a novel about a saint. Then she suddenly asked herself, by the way, what kind of book she had read, what it was called, and who she had become after reading this book. Realizing it was all just a book, the girl suddenly felt much better. All her pain vanished in an instant, just like a lie disappears, and a moment later, the fire around her suddenly vanished. The girl found herself in a completely different, unfamiliar place. This place was completely unfamiliar to her. She'd never been here before, and she felt incredibly calm and confident. A pure, warm light shone around her, seeming to warm her body and soul. Everything about this place was literally beckoning. She felt incredibly peaceful and began to look around in amazement, trying not to miss any detail of this unusual place. Cordelia tried with all her might to figure out where she was. Everything here was unfamiliar, and she couldn't understand how she had ended up here. As she took a few steps forward, she saw a silver-haired girl in old, dirty rags sitting on the floor in front of her. She was busy reading a book. Cordelia took a few more steps toward the stranger. It seemed she absolutely had to find out who she was. She came up to her from behind, looked over the girl's shoulder, trying to make out her face. She was simply stunned by what she saw. This could only have happened in a dream or some phantasmagorical world. It couldn't possibly be happening. Looking closely at the little girl who was now sitting on her knees, reading some book, she suddenly realized that she was somehow seeing herself. And this was even more incomprehensible. The other Cordelia, who was kneeling before her, raised her head towards her, smiled sweetly at her, and looked into her eyes. Then something even more incomprehensible happened. The girl uttered just one word, "Nobody," and suddenly fell silent for a moment, as if lost in thought. After that, she continued, and there was nothing good in her words for the girl, since she herself told herself that no one would save her. Cordelia suddenly shot up from her seat. Her eyes were wide open, and thick tears were streaming from them. She clutched the blanket that was covering her at that moment. As it turned out, she had been lying in her bed in the Duke's palace all this time, and now, seeing that the girl had regained consciousness, the man immediately addressed her by name, calling her Rosaria. It seems that the man was in complete despair over the condition of his adopted daughter, because he screamed loudly as soon as she woke up and came to her senses. The girl turned her head towards where he was sitting and quietly whispered the word, "Uncle?" After this, she called the young man again and told him that she did not want to die. Duke von Valencia stood silently, looking at the poor girl who, fortunately, had finally come to her senses. He couldn't understand why she had suddenly started talking about her death. He remembered the words he had spoken to that girl in the abandoned house. He had promised and sworn to her then that even if she was not a saint, and even if she was not Rosaline's daughter, he would never hurt her. The man was agonizingly saddened by the thought that the girl could have been seriously harmed. He thought about how he had failed to protect her in any way, and that she could ultimately have died as a result of recent events. The girl's hand reached out to the palm of the young man who was leaning on her bed and lightly stroked it. His little pet, without removing her hand, looked into the young man's face and asked him for a small favor. She wanted him to keep her hand. The man, with cold sweat pouring down his face, looked at the girl with concern and desperately cried out her name. Rosaria, seeing that something had happened to her, but his appeal to the girl was completely in vain. A brief moment later, she closed her eyes again and sank into a deep sleep. She was, as before, unconscious. As soon as the Duke noticed that the girl seemed to be getting sick again and was falling into unconsciousness, he ordered that a doctor be called immediately, but he was immediately told that everything was fine and that he needed to calm down. An elderly maid emerged from behind the young man and approached the girl's bed, asking him for permission to take a look. The MMA took a closer look at the girl and was relieved to see that she was fine. She told the Duke there was no need to worry, as his pet had simply fallen asleep. The Duke was very worried about the girl's fate and health. He kept his eyes on her and listened to her quiet breathing, hoping that everything would be all right. Her hand, which had just recently reached out to him, now lay insensible and motionless on top of the blanket. The young man remembered the girl's request, which she had expressed to him before she fell asleep, and immediately placed his palm on top of the girl's hand. After that, he hugged the girl's head, touched his lips to her forehead, and kissed her. Just a touch of magic to give her good dreams. Some time passed thus, during which the girl continued to lie in her bed. She would wake up and then fall asleep again, and no one could figure out what had caused her sudden illness. Finally, the day came when she felt completely better, and Cordelia opened her eyes wide, sat up in bed, and began to look around. The girl was only interested in one question: where she was. She didn't remember returning to the palace after her walk, and therefore couldn't understand how she ended up there. She wondered what had happened and tried to reconstruct the events that had happened to her. She remembered what had happened at that exhibition, and then suddenly wondered if she had dreamed it all. She began to recall the events of the last few days. First, she remembered how she had quarreled with her uncle in the dining room because he didn't want the prince to join them. After that, she went to the exhibition with her teacher and met a rather strange boy there. Her next encounter was even stranger and more unexpected. A boy with red hair appeared, doing simply unimaginable things. The next thing that came to the girl's mind was the memory of being unable to escape the blazing flames surrounding her. And at that moment, she also remembered the heat and pain that simply overwhelmed her. She couldn't imagine how all this could have happened. Immediately after the exhibition, she found herself in a completely different place, feeling hot and painful. To make sure she was okay, the girl immediately began to feel her body and face, trying to make sure that all of this was just a vision and did not actually happen to her. Having finished her examination, Cordelia breathed a sigh of relief and thought that, fortunately, it had not been real, and now she was completely fine. She began to listen to the sounds that penetrated her room from outside, curious to know if she had missed anything important in the life of this palace. Cordelia continued to sit in her bed, wondering why no one was with her now. She was completely alone here, and she felt utterly lonely in this emptiness. But this did not last long. After some time, an elderly maid entered her room, and noticing that the girl had already come to her senses, literally ran away and exclaimed in admiration. Turning to the young lady, when Emma asked the girl if everything was okay with her, she stuck her head out of the blanket and asked the woman how she ended up there. The faithful servant told the girl that she had fainted during a visit to the vernissage, and that her teacher had brought her here to the palace. She then asked her young mistress if she was hungry and would like some cream puffs. Rosaria immediately said that she would agree to everything that was given to her, and then asked where her uncle was, and Emma answered her that the gentleman was now in the library. The maid also informed the girl that the Duke had said he wanted to speak with her immediately after her meal. This surprised the girl a little. After that, she began to worry about this conversation. She wondered if the Duke would scold her now. But still, she didn't regret hitting that guy with the painting at all. When the girl got up from her bed and went to the dining room, she thought on the way that even if she thought about it, a commoner dared to hit an aristocrat, and it was unlikely that they would simply turn a blind eye to such a thing, and she would have to answer for everything. After she'd eaten, it was time to head to the library, where a young man was waiting for her. The girl prepared herself to answer for her misdeeds. It was time to answer for her actions. She knocked and entered the library, only to notice that the Duke looked in her direction with indifference and did not even stand up to greet her. Rosaria braced herself for the worst. She thought she would face severe punishment for such an act, and perhaps no longer have a foster parent. The girl frowned and her eyes sparkled slightly. She was ready to be punished or scolded, but something completely different happened, something she hadn't expected. Her teacher was present at the library, and he immediately bowed to her and said he was very sorry for his mistress, as he had dared to leave her alone, and that was unforgivable. Simon continued to stand before her, his body bowed. He said he was ready to accept any punishment, but the girl had no desire for that. When she said that nothing bad had happened and that she was just as much to blame, the teacher objected, saying that he had dared to leave her unattended and that he should definitely be punished for that. The young man said that he was completely giving himself into the hands of the young lady, and if she wished, he was ready to leave this house right now. He explained his actions by saying that as soon as he appeared at the exhibition, he was immediately surrounded on all sides. He, it turned out, was quite popular. But then, the young man added that this was no excuse at all, and he understood that he deserved severe punishment for being distracted from his duties. Still standing hunched over the girl, the teacher said he could have easily gotten rid of the annoying people that time, and that wasn't the reason at all. He should have remembered that the girl's safety was paramount. Simon said he believed his biggest mistake was not waiting for the girl and simply moving on without making sure she was okay. Rosaria listened carefully to her teacher and thought that even if no one had distracted him, the young man was still innocent. She also remembered that he had disliked her from the very beginning because he was sure that the girl had the blood of the hated Oryx family. She did not want this man to be punished for anything, and therefore, turning to the teacher, she reminded him that he still had his responsibilities, and if he left, then who would study with her? After this, the girl turned to the Duke with a question about whether it was possible not to punish the young man, and he responded that in no case was it possible, and such a thing could not be ignored. Therefore, the young man must definitely bear at least some punishment. The young lady immediately wondered if she should really be the one to choose her teacher's punishment. It was quite a difficult decision, but it seemed the problem was soon solved. The girl raised her hand, her index finger sticking out, and said that's what they should do. Still holding her finger up, the girl said that she thought a fair punishment would be for Simon to eat only cold food for a month. The young man seemed a little surprised by this punishment. He looked at the girl with incomprehension and wondered how easy it would be for him to bear it. A few seconds later, he closed his eyes and said the word, cold. It was unclear whether the little student's decision made him happy or sad. The girl glanced at her adoptive father to make sure he wouldn't be too harsh on her for this punishment. His gaze was unintelligible, so the girl decided everything was fine. Rosaria thought that after this, the teacher not only did not distance himself from her, but even praised her. And besides, her father also said that she acted quite fairly, and he was happy with her decision. From both men, she learned that after what happened at the art exhibition, Edmund apologized to its organizers for starting the fire. Rumors have spread in high society that the exhibition's organizers abused their position, and that, following recent events, they will now receive the punishment they deserve. The girl's life went on as usual. To her great happiness, her life wasn't limited to the confines of the ducal palace. She was promised that she could go outside the palace into the city, accompanied by adults, which is exactly what she was doing now. This time, her adoptive father, the Duke, also went for a walk with her, walking next to the girl who was enjoying her favorite cake, and a little behind them walked the guard and the maid who accompanied them. Duke von Valencia turned his head to the little girl and said he was ready to fulfill any of her wishes. He said that if she just wanted something and told him, he would buy it for her right away. The young woman walking beside him had no dreams at all. Her only desires were the treat she now held in her hands. It was so delicious that she even closed her eyes. She was glad that they were able to go for a walk together today. She felt very comfortable walking next to this grown man who was ready to fulfill her every wish. The Duke kept glancing at the girl. She was something new to him, something that had only recently appeared in his life and completely changed its usual course. Now the girl looked at the cake in her hand and thought that no matter how much she ate, she still couldn't grow. She was still shorter than many of her peers, and while she was thinking about this, she suddenly noticed with bewilderment that there was no one next to her. Ahead of her walked a young man she didn't know at all. The girl was ready to panic and rush off to find her loved one. She didn't want to get lost in the huge city right now, but, thank heavens, the next moment a strong hand grabbed her palm again, and she felt the warmth emanating from it. She was delighted that the man took her hand. To make sure he didn't change his mind, she decided to tell him herself that she'd eaten not only bread, but also ice cream, and now her hands were sticky. To which the Duke replied that it was no big deal and suggested she go buy the girl a doll. When they were already approaching one of the stores, right before their eyes, one of the sellers pushed a homeless girl away and shouted at her that he had told her to get out, and asked if she really didn't understand this at all. The Duke immediately turned to the man and asked him what was going on. The man laughed in response, turned to the Duke, calling him Your Grace, and said that nothing of the sort had happened. It was just another beggar interfering with his work. When the merchant asked the Duke what his lordship wished, he replied that he wanted to buy his daughter's doll. The girl listened attentively to their conversation, and when the Duke once again confirmed that he wanted to buy his daughter's doll, the merchant said that that's who everyone's been talking about lately, and called her a lovely lady. At the moment when the seller said that the girl was a direct copy of her father, the girl did not take her eyes off the poor, homeless girl, who was quickly walking away somewhere. Rosaria had no time for the gift. She couldn't take her eyes off the poor girl, and for a moment, she compared her life to that of this poor, homeless girl. She could have been in her place right now. When she was asked to choose a doll, she was not at all pleased. In her past life, she could only dream of something like this, but now, she couldn't care less. And yet, when the Duke asked her if she liked her new toy, the girl exclaimed that it was very beautiful and looked like it was alive. In the next moments, the girl suddenly stopped in place and began to look around. When she looked into the window of the store now located next to them, she saw herself reflected in the reflection. She thought she looked like a real wealthy aristocrat holding an expensive doll. Looking again at the toy that was in her hands, the girl suddenly thought that she herself was no different from it now, and looked exactly like this doll. Looking closely at the toy, she suddenly thought that all this was short-lived, and as soon as the saint appeared, the Duke would definitely abandon her, and it was unknown whether she would be able to appear on the street in this form again. She decided that it was absolutely necessary to do something. The girl had already made her decision, and now she had to do it. The Duke cried out in surprise, asking the girl where she was going after she shouted that she would be back soon and ran away. She ran as fast as she could. People passed by, but she ignored them and ran without stopping for a second. She remembered the direction the girl had gone after being chased away from the store. And now she found her sitting against a wall in a dark alley. The girl looked poor and unkempt. She held a simple toy in her hands, very similar to the one Rosaria had in her past life. Seeing the stranger who suddenly appeared here, the girl immediately raised her eyes and looked at her in surprise. Rosaria held out the doll she'd just bought and held it out to the girl. She said it was hers and asked if she wanted it. While the girl, holding out the doll, was thinking that she should share with others what she had, the Duke also managed to run up to this alley and, having caught his breath, asked the girl where she had run off to and said that he would be very worried if she got lost. Rosaria held the toy that belonged to this poor girl in her hands. She wanted no one to worry about her and was glad that at least someone cared. She suddenly realized that the young man was worried about her, and so she decided that she absolutely had to ask him for forgiveness. The Duke was surprised to hear his little adopted daughter tell him that she had decided to give the doll he had given her to a homeless girl. When she asked if he would be angry with her for this, the young man replied that the doll belonged to her and she could do with it whatever she wanted. The man took a closer look at the toy the girl was holding and noted that it didn't look much like a toy and looked more like some kind of parody. The girl decided that perhaps she would answer all the questions later and said nothing to the Duke when he said that he did not quite understand why she acted this way. She suddenly remembered what this girl looked like. She was defenseless and alone, and no one paid attention to her. Rosaria suddenly thought that when she saw this girl, she saw herself in her and felt that such an act would be right, and she could not act in any other way. The girl came close to the young man, asked him for forgiveness, and said that she was wrong when she called him an idiot. The Duke replied that it wasn't worth apologizing for. He believed it was he, not her, who should apologize for not wanting to let Prince Julian near her. After that, he stroked the girl on the head and said that it was he who was wrong, when he actually thought that the curse could be contagious. Rosaria was delighted that her adoptive father had agreed with her. She was already eager to meet the boy living in their palace. After the Duke asked the girl if she wanted to go anywhere else, she replied that perhaps she should go to the bakery to buy some more cakes, and she would very much like to treat Julian to some. The Duke replied that he couldn't refuse her. He thought that the girl had finally decided to go somewhere with him, and the reward for that should be delicious cakes. Prince Julian sat opposite the girl in the dining room without touching his food. Next to him sat the pensive Duke, just as he had been before, thinking about something of his own. The Duke's little pet was holding a cake. She suddenly stopped eating it and asked the man and boy why they weren't eating. In response to the little girl's question, the boy sitting across from her immediately answered. The prince smiled and said that the Duke liked completely different dishes and didn't like sweets. But as it turned out, the boy was slightly mistaken, because the Duke immediately picked up a pastry from the table and began munching on it, to which the boy remarked that the Duke's tastes seemed to have changed considerably lately. But the Duke replied that this was not at all the case. The three of them sat in the dining room, chatting peacefully. They ate cakes and washed them down with aromatic tea, until at some point the prince asked the host if he had received a letter from his father. Prince Julian smiled and said, "Well, that's wonderful," after the Duke replied that if he was asking about the letter in which the Emperor had given his approval for Rosaria's adoption, then indeed he had already received it. The Duke looked closely at the boy sitting next to him. He understood the reason for the question and was pleased that the boy was so overjoyed at the fact that he had adopted his adopted daughter. He couldn't take his eyes off this boy, who was dear to him because he was his sister's son. He didn't know how to compromise or please him. The Duke was deep in thought, pondering how to approach the prince. It was absolutely necessary, but he couldn't figure out how to do it. The prince seemed to be feeling much better lately. The attacks caused by his curse had become quite rare, and there was no indication that the boy was seriously ill. As if reading his thoughts, the prince spoke up and said he'd been told treatment could take a very long time. He then added that it wasn't just therapy, according to his diagnosis, and that it could take about 3 years. When the Duke asked him if that was all, the boy replied that it could only be because he was almost like a son to him, but at the time the last request was sent to the Emperor, he agreed. The Duke fell into deep thought again. He felt very sorry for this child, who suffered so unbearably from the curse placed upon him. He looked again closely at his nephew, who continued drinking tea. In his opinion, 3 years was a long enough time, and if Julian remained alive after that time, the Emperor could take his life at any moment. These were the unspoken rules that prevailed in their society and empire, and the supreme ruler could be forced to do this in order for his favorite son to become his sole heir. The Duke thought it was just a business deal, a deal whose price was the boy's life, a deal with his father. And then the Duke told the boy that he should absolutely not go along with it. They continued eating cakes, and the girl asked the Duke if Julian was in pain, and added that she hoped he was feeling better, and offered the boy to eat so that food would help him get better faster. The young man turned to the girl and said that since he had now received permission from the Emperor, and she had become a member of his family, it was imperative to announce this. The girl was simply stunned by this news. She was even more stunned when she said that no one would dare call his daughter Rosaria an orphan now. He then asked the girl if she remembered her birthday. Since the girl replied that she knew nothing about it, the Duke said that in that case, let the day she became part of his family also be her birthday, and they should invite guests to the celebration as soon as possible. The girl asked in surprise what the word holiday meant after the Duke told her about his plans. After this, she finally realized that this was not simple news. The girl, with surprise in her eyes, turned to the Duke and asked if he was really her father now, calling him Papa. It seemed to her that the word that had accidentally flown from her lips was still premature, and she immediately fell silent mid-sentence, thinking about what she should do now. Cordelia informed the Duke that they would probably have to discuss all this further. Then she thanked him for his concern and said she would always behave appropriately. But then, sitting in her chair, the girl said that although she had become a member of his family, the young man was still only her uncle. The Duke didn't seem at all bothered by this. He said he understood her and that everything was fine. He also added that the girl could call him whatever she liked, when the girl then declared that, by the way, she really wanted to eat the cookies that she had been given last time. The prince asked her if she was talking about the gift she had received from Prince Lampez, and received an affirmative answer. The boy said that, unfortunately, a lot of time had passed since then, and he thought that they could no longer be eaten, and he promised the girl that he would definitely bring her something tastier. Rosaria couldn't wait to see what the prince had prepared for her. She was always hungry and wouldn't refuse anything delicious. Besides, according to the prince, it was something unusual. The boy sitting opposite her said that the cookies she had received as a gift were definitely not edible, and therefore advised the girl to throw them away. She immediately looked at the prince in surprise, unable to understand how anyone could throw away food. It was completely impossible for her. It would be better to feed it to someone. After this, Prince Julian asked the Duke if there were any celebrities planned for Rosaria's birthday party. While the Duke replied that, of course, it was planned, the girl reflected on how angry Prince Julian had been just a moment ago. Now he was smiling, but his face looked so miserable. When the prince asked his uncle whether they would invite Prince Lampus and Prince Petros to the celebration, the Duke promised that he would think about it and announce his decision later. The next 2 weeks passed like a single day at the ducal palace. Everyone was very busy, as preparations for the young lady's birthday were underway. Days and nights were filled with bustle. Cordelia lay on her bed, her arms and legs spread wide. She thought about how, with all this commotion, Simon had no time for their lessons, and now she could play all day long, except on the days when she had dances. But then the girl suddenly became sad. Her eyes widened as she remembered Prince Julian telling her he wouldn't be at the upcoming celebration. Upon hearing this, the girl immediately told him that he would most likely feel very lonely if he stayed there, while everyone else was celebrating and having fun. The boy remained silent at first, and then asked again if it was true when Cordelia asked him to come, and said that everyone would be very happy to see the prince, and she would be the happiest of all. Now, lying in her bed, the girl recalled their conversation. She remembered that although Julian had smiled during the conversation, he looked absolutely miserable, and this greatly upset her. The little lady's thoughts were interrupted by a maid entering her room. The girl said that since Miss Emma was busy, she asked her to take care of the young lady, and added that her name was Mia. The girl raised her head and looked closely at the young servant. She said that meant her favorite servant was busy, and then said that she would really like to take a walk around the estate right now. The girl immediately bowed to her mistress and replied that she was at her complete disposal and was ready to accompany the girl on her walk. After this, she told the girl that she would now help her get ready and dress appropriately for the upcoming walk. The girl looked very strange during the conversation. She seemed very afraid of something. Her clasped hands trembled violently. The maid thought the young lady might reveal her true nature at any moment. Looking at this girl, she thought she had charmed the Duke so much that he had adopted her. Besides, when she went for walks with the Duke, the girl always took this dirty doll with her, as if she had just picked it up from the dump. She couldn't understand why she couldn't buy a new toy. She recalled a conversation with a friend who also worked at the palace. She'd said there was a reason for this, and she was absolutely certain the doll was cursed. She simply frightened Mia with her words about Emma, saying that the girl had won the Duke's heart, and that was why he had adopted her, and then asked her interlocutor if this did not seem, in her opinion, very strange. She took her friend by the hand and said that the little girl had simply bewitched the Duke with her charms, and then added to Mia that she needed to be very careful. Both friends held each other's hands and promised themselves to be very careful from now on in order to survive. Now the girl thought about her friend's warning. She had sternly warned her to be careful and keep her ears open when dealing with the little mistress. The maid thought about all this until the moment when a little girl turned to her and thus brought her out of the terrible and difficult thoughts about her difficult fate. Rosaria told the maid that it was ready, and then asked if she could take some cookies with her, to which the girl replied that, of course she could. In response to these words, the girl smiled broadly and, hugging the toy to her chest, thanked the maid, and then added that Mia was the best. The girl didn't understand what they were talking about. She lacked the courage and words to even object to this girl. She was terribly afraid that she might bewitch her or even curse her. But something completely different happened. The maid was completely unexpected and cried out in delight after the girl showed her the item. She handed her a piece of paper with a picture of a girl with red hair. The girl said it was her gift to the maid. While she was looking at what was depicted in the picture, the girl came closer to her and quietly whispered that in 10 years, this painting would be worth a fortune. Rosaria continued and said that she would have loved to keep the child for herself, but she still decided to give him to the girl. The girl was simply stunned by everything that had happened and couldn't utter a word in response. She didn't dare refuse the gift for fear of incurring his wrath and falling into disfavor. That is why the maid thanked her mistress for the gift and promised her that she would keep this painting until the end of her days, to which the girl thought that it was still not worth going so far ahead. Seeing her friend's nervousness after receiving the gift, Mia covered her mouth with her hand to stifle her laughter. She was very amused by the look of horror and fear in her friend's eyes. But time was moving inexorably towards the upcoming holiday, and when everything was completely ready, the young lady's birthday finally arrived. The royal family was likely avoiding society at the time. That's why they politely declined the invitation to the Duke and his daughter in advance, citing their busy schedules. The remaining ducal families also appear to have decided not to attend the celebration. They reported that they had not received an invitation and therefore would not be able to attend. The interior of the ducal palace had changed noticeably recently. Everything was solemn and magnificent, sparkling with luxury, as everyone prepared for today's birthday. In order to attend such a significant event, many aristocrats came from all over the country, wanting to see the girl who was destined to become a member of this noble family. This young lady was also restless. She was excited about appearing in front of a huge crowd for the first time today, especially as the Duke's daughter. She was terrified that something might go wrong. When all the preparations were completed, Duke Lorenzo appeared in his ceremonial uniform on the stairs leading to the banquet hall. Von Valencia, walking slowly along the soft path that covers the steps. A little girl, dressed in the latest fashion, walked alongside the young man. Just before the party, she had been taken to a fashion store where the very best clothes had been selected. When the herald announced the Duke of Valencia and his daughter had entered the hall, all eyes immediately turned in their direction. Hisses from the nobles began to murmur, wondering if the Duke had really hidden his daughter for so long, and what kind of foolish gossip was this? Many people took a closer look at the Duke and the little girl. Some said they didn't even look alike, and it seemed very strange. The young man and his adopted daughter stopped on a high balcony overlooking one of the walls of the ceremonial hall. All the people who had arrived for the celebration immediately raised their heads to greet the palace's hosts. There were so many people here that, looking down for a moment, the girl immediately became terrified. It was the first time she had ever been exposed to such a huge crowd. She felt like everyone was looking at her at that moment. It was terrifying, and those eyes fixed on her seemed utterly frightening to the girl. She suddenly thought that all these people had gathered here just to stare at her, because now they were all looking, without taking their eyes off her, and that's why the girl's hands began to tremble nervously. She was supposed to greet all these people, but, as luck would have it, the words flew out of her head, and the girl only stumbled as she tried to deliver a welcoming speech. Unfortunately, nothing was working out. She'd spent so long preparing for this event, and now all those preparations had gone to waste. But at some point, the girl suddenly saw a hand in the crowd with a splayed hand, making a signal to her. The girl kept her gaze fixed on that hand. She raised her eyes above the crowd, and the reflection of that palm appeared in the pupil of her eye. That raised hand belonged to her mentor, who stood behind the people gathered for the celebration and signaled to the girl, reminding her that she should now give her speech. The young man pointed his finger at his palm and repeated the word palm with his lips, and then silently repeated to the girl, "Your palm." Rosaria immediately understood what her beloved teacher was reminding her of. Everything was precise. She remembered writing down what she was supposed to say on her palm, and now she began to peer at it intently, trying to decipher the text written there. But, to her dismay, the letters became illegible. The girl became nervous and sweaty, causing the letters to rub off and become completely illegible. The girl thought this was a complete failure. She would now disgrace not only herself, but also the Duke, who had been so kind to her and who had organized this birthday party for her. Looking at her palm, Rosaria decided she had to do something. She said she'd first like to thank everyone for accepting the invitation and coming to the celebration. The people, who had not taken their eyes off the balcony, silently listened to the words of this little one, who began to speak quietly, and then louder and louder. Finally, she loudly shouted out words of gratitude to everyone gathered for coming to visit her today. At this point, the girl's short speech ended. She had nothing more to say, and a silent pause ensued, after which everyone still awaited the palace master's words. Among these people was the little girl's mentor. He was extremely nervous because the speech he and the girl had prepared had never been delivered. He was ready to sink into the ground at that moment. At Simon, he was in agony, and cold beads of sweat were running down his face. The young man thought this was the end for him, and he would surely be severely punished for this. And while the young man was thinking that everything was very bad, the young master of the palace raised his hands and began to slowly clap his hands after his little daughter finished her short speech. Those present at the celebration couldn't understand what was happening. They looked around silently, unsure what would happen next, but after a while, they too were forced to join in the applause of the host. The ovation grew louder and louder, and eventually everyone began to applaud the little girl. The young man and his adopted daughter began to descend the steps into the banquet hall to join the guests who had arrived for the birthday party. Rosaria was in the midst of a difficult moment. She felt that her actions had ruined the celebration everyone had worked so hard to achieve. It was difficult for her to accept that she had made a mistake and hadn't been able to deliver the speech she had prepared clearly. When she told her adoptive father about this, the Duke smiled back at her and said that this was not at all true, because today was her day, and she could do whatever she wanted. The girl was overjoyed to hear this. Indeed, today was her day, and she wanted it to be unforgettable, and she didn't want to be upset for a second. And although this day should have been a real celebration for her, everything turned out quite differently. After a while, the girl became bored and began to yawn. She wasn't interested in the entertainment, so she decided to step away for a bit. Suddenly, someone addressed her as Princess Valencia, and the girl instantly became alert and turned her head to the side to see who was speaking to her. Approached Rosaria, and introducing herself, told her name. She said her name was Sophia, Cartrain, and then added that she would like to wish her a happy birthday. Smiling broadly, the girl told her that she was even more beautiful than she had imagined, and then added that if the girl said that she was a noblewoman, no one would be able to doubt it. Rosaria didn't want to talk to this pretentious girl at all, and so she said that she didn't either, and hurried away from her as far as possible. But the girl didn't want to be left behind. She laughed slightly and added that the princess was very happy, and Daniel would be simply shocked and would definitely faint if he saw her now. Rosaria was intrigued and asked her interlocutor who this Daniel was. It seemed like the girl was literally stunned. She loudly shouted to the girl that they were talking about her cousin, and his name was Daniel Fordner. Afterwards, she explained that she was talking about the boy she had met at the vernissage. He was the son of the family that organized the exhibition. Her statement didn't faze the young hostess at all. She raised her index finger and casually asked the girl, "So, what's the big deal?" Her interlocutor's face immediately turned sad. She said that the family that organized the exhibition couldn't handle the scandal that erupted there, and as a result, they went bankrupt. She then added that even ignoring the fact that the girl had hit Daniel, his family was bankrupt again, and asked if that was fair. Rosaria replied that she didn't want such a sad outcome for them, and just told the truth that their family kills people, and besides, this boy insulted her, and is that fair? The girl standing in front of her extended her hand towards Rosaria and told her that she might not know it, but everyone lived like that, because they were nobles and the rest of the people were commoners. And vice versa, the aristocrats even showed them mercy. Then, as if remembering something, the girl grinned and said that indeed it was true, and she seemed to have completely forgotten that their princess was also just a simpleton. She laughed loudly, and then said that it really irritated her that he was insulting people among whom he was just yesterday. In the next few moments, the girl's face changed strangely. She was horrified by what she saw and was ready to scream in terror, but only by gathering her strength did she manage to restrain herself. A huge wild animal appeared before her feet. Its head turned directly toward the girls conversing. Seeing the effect that the appearance of this animal in the hall produced, a loud laugh was heard from some boy who had brought the wild animal here. It was an old friend of the little hostess of the celebration, who looked in her direction and asked the girl why she was alone on her birthday. The girl thought she was obviously being held captive, and then asked the boy what it was. The Duke replied that it was his birthday present, and he thought she would like it. Still smiling broadly, Edmund said that the girl was so small and thin, and besides, his family would definitely send her another gift later. When the girl told him that he himself was like a wild boar, the boy replied that the only one who called him a boar was she, and added that she was all alone, asking whether this was the behavior of a wild boar or a man. Rosaria turned nervously in his direction and hastened to assure the boy that, firstly, she was not alone here, because a lot of people had come to congratulate her. The red-haired Duke advised her to look around, and after the girl did so, he said that it seemed to him that she was still alone at this celebration. After that, the boy started looking around. He asked if Black had been there, adding that they had been arguing about who would come first, and naturally, he seemed to have won. Rosaria turned away from the boy and wondered why he was there. She remembered very well that she hadn't invited him to her celebration. After his search for his friend proved futile, Edmund turned to the girl again and said that it was a holiday, and asked her if she wanted to dance. Rosaria hastened to answer that she didn't want to, and thought that this boy was a real impudent one and only hurt himself, not paying any attention to those around him. The boy was hard to stop. Energy was simply bursting out of him, and hearing the music, he turned to the girl and asked if he imagined he was hearing the sounds of the first dance. He extended his palm towards the girl, inviting her to dance, and said that, of course, she should definitely dance with him. Rosaria firmly replied that she didn't want to do that. She didn't want to dance, especially with such an impudent, uninvited guest. The Duke asked her why she didn't want to do it, and added that she didn't have a partner anyway. The girl immediately turned her back on him and decided it wasn't even worth talking to him anymore. She wanted to get rid of this annoying boy as quickly as possible, but it wasn't so easy. He grabbed her wrist and urged her to wait. She tried as hard as she could, but she couldn't break free from his tight grip. The boy held her tightly, and she didn't know what to do now to avoid getting into another scandal. The girl began to peer into the crowd, hoping to spot someone there who could stand up for her. Unfortunately, there was no one she knew, and no one rushed to her aid. Without letting go of the hand of the girl standing next to her, the boy said he needed to tell her something important. This was one of those times when it was absolutely necessary to talk, and let's add that he had already spoken about this with Duke Petros. As soon as the young man began speaking to her and telling her to be very careful, he suddenly felt someone's heavy hand rest on his shoulder. He immediately perked up. It was quite unexpected for him, and the boy was very scared when a rough male voice asked him what he wanted from the daughter of the man who was now standing behind him. The red-haired boy immediately bared his teeth, feeling a strong grip that never loosened. He thought it was truly painful, and that this man had a grip of steel. After this, the Duke of Valencia ordered his knights to immediately send this boy to the underground dungeon until the end of the festival, which was immediately done. At that moment, as the boy shouted at her to wait for him, the girl wasn't wondering if the Duke was serious about the dungeon. To her, it seemed unimaginable and very cruel. A few seconds later, the girl's young mentor joined them, turning to the Duke and saying that there was a very important topic for conversation. After the young man asked his assistant what had happened, he replied that the Duke needed to go with him to the dungeon, and there he would see everything with his own eyes. The Duke stroked his daughter's head and said that they would see each other soon, and then congratulated her once again on her birthday. Rosaria waved goodbye to her father and the teacher who accompanied him, and began to think about what important thing the boy wanted to tell her. It seemed she had absolutely no time to be bored that evening. Immediately afterward, she was distracted from her thoughts by another boy, who appeared seemingly out of nowhere and told the girl that she seemed busy. He looked rather strange, because, to the girl's surprise, this boy's face was hidden by a cat mask, and it was completely impossible to find out who was hiding behind it. The mystery was soon solved when he lifted his mask slightly and addressed the girl, calling her Princess Valencia. Of course she recognized it as Black, and as soon as she asked the boy why he was wearing a mask, he replied that if he was spotted, they would immediately take him away. just like what had happened to Edmund not long ago. The girl immediately asked her interlocutor when he arrived, and whether he had seen what had happened the day before. She was deeply upset to hear him reply that he'd arrived at the party when almost no one else was there. She thought that since he'd been there from the very beginning, the shame she'd endured couldn't have escaped his attention. But the boy seemed indifferent. He bowed before her and said he was very happy to congratulate her on her birthday, and then asked the young mistress of the palace if she had kept his brooch. The girl asked him questioningly what he meant, and then, sighing, said that she carefully guarded this little thing so as not to lose it. Black said it was very kind of her. He added that the brooch was very dear to him and asked her not to lose it under any circumstances. Rosaria was immediately upset, thinking that this thing was important to the boy, and she had treated him so shamelessly. She thought it was just an expensive piece of jewelry, and so she asked him for something in return for the favor. She didn't even notice how she responded to the boy's offer to dance, and immediately found herself circling in the center of the hall. The music grew louder as they approached the orchestra, and at that point, the boy asked her if she really could dance, and then, belatedly it seemed, asked her if she would dance with him. She didn't understand what was going on around her, and so she asked why she had become the object of his attention. The boy hiding behind the cat mask continued to twirl her in a dance and said that now he needed her. The girl asked him again what he had said. He replied that she still hadn't chosen a partner for her first dance and had been wandering around the room the entire time. Without stopping dancing, she asked her partner if he was watching her, and in response, the boy said that his gaze always directed towards her, regardless of his desire. The boy looked toward the pair of knights and said he could tell her even more. It wasn't just him, but many others were watching her during today's celebration, and several knights were now waiting for the melody to end so they could take him away, thinking he'd come here uninvited. Afterwards, Black said he certainly had an invitation and asked the girl if she remembered his silly little brother. He was the one who had persuaded his parents and gotten the invitation. Rosaria immediately understood everything and told the young man that this meant that he had stolen the invitation from his younger brother. She didn't hear an answer to her question. Her partner asked the girl where she learned to dance and noticed that she had been stepping on both of his feet the whole time. When she asked the boy if he was unhappy about something, he replied that he was not at all. After the music ended, her partner was immediately surrounded by a pair of the Duke's knights, who led him away from the hall, where the festive banquet was continuing. Rosaria only remained with a sour expression on her face, waving after her departing friend. She was once again left completely alone in this enormous hall filled with strangers. She felt uneasy, thinking that the day she should have remembered for the rest of her life had turned out to be rather unfortunate. The girl thought that all this was arranged for her, but she did not feel this celebration, which was truly grandly arranged on the occasion of her birth. But she still decided that she shouldn't be sad, and seeing familiar faces in the crowd, she immediately rushed towards them, trying not to lose sight of them. Today truly was a happy day, and she longed to share it with those dear to her. So she ran to the Duke, who stood with her sweet maid and mentor. Rosaria laughed joyfully and said that she thought that from now on, every day would be filled with nothing but happiness. She really wanted it to be so. Nothing should spoil this celebration, but neither she nor those close to her could know that everything was not so simple, and somewhere in the depths of the ducal palace, a villain, armed with a sharp dagger, was hiding, ready to commit his vile crime. After this, the Duke invited the girl outside the palace. When she agreed, he led her to a place where two amazing creatures were tied up, which, according to the Duke, were intended as a gift for her. When she saw these animals, the girl could only loudly exclaim the word, "Wow!" because these were amazing creatures, and it was the first time she had seen flying unicorns. When she asked the young man if it was possible to fly on these animals, he immediately answered her question with his own question whether she would like to try riding them. When the girl said that she really wanted this, she was immediately seated in the saddle on one of the horses tied near the palace. When the girl sat comfortably on the horse, she sighed heavily with surprise and amazement, since it was quite high here. At some point, she turned her head towards the corner of the palace and noticed that some person had disappeared behind it, and she did not have time to see who it was. The girl stared intently after the disappearing stranger and hoped that it was just some other person. The next moment, the horse she was sitting on suddenly flapped its wings. A girl on horseback soared into the air. A groom standing next to the Duke said there was nothing dangerous about it, as the horse was currently tied up and therefore couldn't fly very high. Rosaria felt wonderful. It was a new sensation for her. She was floating in the air, the wind brushing against her face and clothes. Preoccupied with her new sensations, she didn't notice that something seemed to have suddenly happened to the horse. Her eyes turned red, as if bloodshot, and her body began to tremble violently. The girl did not notice all this, as she was enjoying the flight and shouted to her uncle that she was flying now, and it was just great. But then her expression suddenly changed. She noticed that something had suddenly changed, and her unicorn began to act very strangely. She gripped the reins tightly as the horse shook violently. The girl pressed her legs against the horse's sides, trying to calm it down a bit and calm herself down. Rosaria was terrified. She didn't know what to do, so she just whispered the word, "Uncle." She was afraid she was about to fall from a great height. Her unicorn reared up, seeming to try to break the rope it was tied to. It looked as if the animal had suddenly gone berserk. Rosaria realized that perhaps now everything would be resolved. Since there was nowhere to turn for help, and she was riding a horse in the air, no one could get her down. The Duke also noticed that something was wrong. He shouted his daughter's name and asked her if she was okay. The unicorn, in whose saddle she now sat, flapped its wings ever more vigorously. The girl shuddered along with it. With just a few wing beats, the unicorn managed to free itself from the rope that had been restricting its movements. The girl, now seated in its saddle, soared higher and higher as the animal's movement was no longer constrained. Far below, the people remained, unsure of what had just happened. They watched as the animal and the girl sitting in its saddle were carried further and further into the clouds. The Duke seemed the most shocked. He couldn't understand what had happened and wondered why the rope had suddenly broken. Then he suddenly realized that someone had most likely damaged it. In desperation, the man began shouting his adopted daughter's name again. But she could no longer hear him, having risen high into the sky. While everyone was busy watching the girl, no one noticed a boy who suddenly appeared in the yard, grabbed the reins of another unicorn, and prepared to jump on it. It was Prince Julian, who had been absent from the celebration, but had somehow found himself here now, and considered it his duty to take up the rescue of his cousin. The Duke immediately called on him to stop, because he thought that such an incident was not an accident at all, and if it was done on purpose, then the remaining unicorn was also dangerous to ride. And while the Duke tried in vain to persuade the boy not to do something stupid, the second unicorn also soared into the sky and quickly approached the first and its unlucky rider. The girl held tightly to the horse's reins and trembled. She didn't hear the voices calling her name, and all she could think about was when it would all end. There was fear in the girl's eyes, as she noticed that she had already risen high above the ground, and if she fell now, she would certainly break her fall. Suddenly, she heard someone next to her loudly shout her name. The girl turned her head and saw the prince sitting on the second unicorn. Both animals moved at almost the same speed, and so the boy and girl found themselves very close to each other, and could now see each other well. Julian extended his hand towards the girl and told her to grab his hand. Rosaria told the prince that, unfortunately, she couldn't do that. She was terrified, and she couldn't bear to see her hands holding the unicorn. The prince promised her that everything would be fine and asked her to trust him. Looking at his determined face and hearing the firmness with which the prince pronounced his last sentence, the girl thought that she had no other choice but to simply obey him. The prince's hand continued to hang in the air, and he showed with his whole appearance that he should be trusted and grabbed by this hand. The other hand reached out towards the prince's hand, and they almost touched each other the next moment. Despite the fact that the unicorns were moving very quickly, the boy and girl touched each other's fingers. But this did not last long, unfortunately, and the next moment they separated again, and the hands of both children hung in the air. The boy knew he had to act as quickly as possible. He thought that if something happened now, no one would be able to help them. Rosaria looked at him, and she was no longer as scared as before, because now at least someone had volunteered to help her, and perhaps he could succeed. She once again extended her hand towards the prince, and he grabbed her wrist, and the girl, in response, grabbed his hand tightly. Their hands were holding each other, but unfortunately for both of them, the unicorns began to move in different directions again, and the girl suddenly felt that she was starting to lose her balance. Her unicorn suddenly reared up again, as if trying to throw off its rider. Its movements became more and more abrupt. His excitement was transmitted to the other animal. Both horses were nervous and whinnied loudly, which further frightened their riders. A moment later, the girl felt her body suspended in mid-air. The unicorn saddle she'd been sitting on was empty, and she only stayed afloat because the prince held her hand tightly. The boy shouted her name and loudly urged her to hold on to his hand as tightly as possible. She didn't need to be told twice. Rosaria understood that her life was now completely in this boy's power. She thought that just one awkward movement and her body would immediately plummet. Suddenly, she felt something change. She realized that her body was now hurtling toward the Earth's surface. Even at that moment, the girl understood that she was not alone, as the prince's hand continued to hold her firmly by the shoulder. As it turned out, the boy had also been thrown out of his saddle and was now flying head down towards the ground, hugging his cousin. The girl felt her end approaching. She was certain their fall could not end happily. She felt the heat in her body again, and she felt both hot and painful. She seemed to sense every cell of her body refusing to die. After a short fall, the girl suddenly felt a burning pain throughout her body and screamed loudly, feeling that she could no longer breathe. She looked around and noticed a boy's feet next to her. One of them was missing a shoe. When the girl turned her head slightly to the side, she saw the boy's head, from under which a pool of blood was flowing. Rosaria touched the boy's body with her hand, wanting to make sure he was still alive. She quietly whispered his name, then, just as quietly, said the word, "No." After this, she began screaming and crying loudly. She felt unbearably sorry for both herself and the prince, who had decided to sacrifice himself to try and save her. She felt absolutely terrible. She was in unbearable pain, and it suddenly seemed to the girl that there was not a single living place on her, and she suddenly thought that she could not wake up again. She began screaming loudly, just one single word, "No." She touched the boy's body as he lay in a pool of blood, urging him to wake up and open his eyes. She thought it was all just a bad dream. The girl hoped that if she didn't open her eyes, nothing terrible would happen. She wanted to do something. She simply had to do something. Finally, she managed to free her hand from under the prince's body, and she sighed, thinking that now she could properly get down to helping the boy. The girl looked at the prince's face again, but he remained motionless. His body lay there, seemingly showing no signs of life. Rosaria closed her eyes and silently begged the prince not to die, but to live on. She prayed to all the saints to save this poor boy so that he could live on. As if through a veil, she saw his face and hoped that her prayers would not be in vain and the boy would open his eyes. She continued her prayers to the saints, asking them with all her heart to save Prince Julian. The girl was crying loudly and suddenly heard someone shout that it was there, and then said that they had found the prince and princess. She suddenly opened her tear-stained eyes and begged them to save the prince. She wanted this more than she wanted to live. At some point, Rosaria realized she was in a completely different place. Her body suddenly stopped hurting, and she found herself in a warm, bright place where she felt completely comfortable and free. To her surprise, the moment the girl decided to stand up, she felt no pain. She felt as if she had died, as all her suffering suddenly left her. Rosaria looked around and noticed that this place seemed a little familiar. She had been here before, after that incident at the art gallery. She found herself here again and couldn't understand what was happening to her. Looking closer, the girl saw that she was surrounded by a huge number of bookcases filled with thick volumes in bright bindings. The astonished girl could not understand where she found herself now, because all around her there were only books and nothing else. After she stood up, she felt that changes had occurred in her body. It suddenly became very light, and she did not feel any pain at all. She suddenly thought with bitterness that perhaps she had already found herself in the next world, but in that case, it was unclear why there were only books here. The girl decided that she should calm down, analyze the situation, and think about where she now found herself. She looked at the room again and thought that the place looked strangely familiar, even though she had mentally been there before. It seems that all this was not without reason and could only indicate one thing.